Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ghost in the Machine in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 16, See Facing the Past. Toriel had powdered hot cocoa mix and milk, which Chara supposed was close enough to chocolate to satisfy their craving for now. Clasping a hot mug in their own hands was such an amazing feeling. Being alive was amazing. No wonder they'd coveted life so much. There was seeing it through another's eyes, as they'd done while possessing 2B, and there was having eyes, and there was a world of difference Chara had never dreamed of between the two. After all, they'd been dead for quite some time. Since the 8th Machine War, they'd gleaned from 2B's data files they were up to 14 on the surface, which was just to be expected, in fact. How did you do it? Toriel asked as she sat across the dining room table from them with a steaming mug between her own paws. Her eyes were still wide and still glistened with tears. How did you come back? Chara took a sip and felt their black box stop buzzing for a second, their blood stop pumping. The world itself, it seemed, had stopped for that 1 second. Chocolate. I told you, they said, regaining their composure. I just woke up like this. They knew their glib attitude wouldn't arouse their adoptive mother's suspicion. They'd always been like that. You're dressed in such strange clothes. Where did you find them? Chara sighed. I'm afraid I stole them off a corpse, mother. Oh, my goodness. Toriel raised a paw to cover her mouth. My clothes were all gross and decayed. Chara grinned. It was that or come here naked. Somebody had the bad fortune to fall into the mountain and die, so I took their Yoarha uniform. Oh. Toriel nodded along to their sensible answer. What is a Yoarha? Chara shrugged, then finished their hot cocoa, wiping chocolate from their lip. Something very stupid, I'd imagine. You haven't changed a bit. Toriel glanced away. She sniffled. It is you, Chara. That's right. It's me. Chara stood up and came to Toriel's side, laying a hand on her shoulder. They could feel her tremble beneath their touch. Are you all right, mother? Toriel nodded. Yes, my child. Then she leaped up and hugged Chara again, burying them in an avalanche of fur and a shower of tears. No, she wheezed, sobbing. Chara sank into her soft and warm embrace, consoling her as best they could. The last time they'd been hugged like this, they'd been dying, and hadn't had the strength to hug back. They remembered why they loved this place so much. Not this house, they'd only been to it a few times before, but this underground world in general. It was a world where they'd had a family. I hate to ask you this so soon, my child, Toriel let go of Chara. But if you are alive, do you think there is any hope for your brother? Floey, tucked away beneath Chara's armor and pressed close to their chest, writhed. Who knows, mother, said Chara. Anything is possible. I apologize for bringing him up. You are back, and I should be happy just to see you, and I am, but, Toriel smiled weakly. I suppose it is selfish of me to want more. But he was my boy. And he was so close to my heart. Chara reached out to wipe the tears from their mother's eyes, feeling the damp fur on her cheeks beneath their fingertips. Don't feel bad. I understand. He was so close to my heart as well. In a way, he still is, really. Floey sank tiny fangs into Chara's chest. Chara tried very hard not to react. Excuse me, mother, do you have a room I could have to myself for just a short while? Chara asked, holding back with increasing difficulty their winces and grimaces as Floey continued to nibble at them. Oh, Toriel glanced at the floor. I understand if you would like a moment to yourself, she said, obviously disappointed that Chara wanted a moment to themselves. I suppose you may use Ascari's old room. I let the others who have passed through here use it, so it is very tidy. I just need a minute alone to get my bearings. Chara pecked Toriel on the cheek. I love you, mother. Chara hurried into their father's old room, closing the door behind them and surveying the bedroom. For hundreds of generations, monster generations, which were about as long as android generations and much longer than those of humans, Toriel and Ascari had lived in this house in the first monster settlement, home. By the time the two of them had sired Asriel, they had already left the house behind and moved to new home, but occasionally Toriel would bring her children to the ruins for history lessons. After so long, any hint that this room had once belonged to Chara's adoptive father was gone. Floey kept gnawing on Chara's chest, so Chara gave their breastplate a good whack. Their hand came away stinging as Floey sprouted from their collar, wilting over Chara's chest. Ugh, Floey curled around their pendant for support. What was that saccharine crap? I thought we were supposed to become as gods, not get all huggy with that old hag. Chara had been about to go into a "there is a time and a place for everything, dear brother" spiel, but Floey's last word had rankled them. Watch your tongue, Asriel, they cautioned. She's your mother, too. Don't you love her? Floey scoffed at them. What, you do? Of course. With some pride, Chara mused that they might be the only android in the world who knew what it was like to have a proper mother, not a master or mentor, not a teacher, not a commanding officer, but someone who taught, nurtured, and above all loved. It set them apart from the savages on the surface. Of course, Chara repeated. How could you not? How could you not? Floey repeated in a mocking tone. I'll tell you, how can I not? I don't have a soul, Chara. You know? That little thing that lets us monsters feel love, hope, compassion? Sorry, I'm fresh out of those things. Have you tried? Floey giggled. Have I tried? Have I tried, they ask. They brushed their petals against Chara's cheek. Boy did I. When I woke up, the first thing I did was hurry my little green behind over to Dad's garden. I wasted weeks with that stupid king, vainly hoping I would feel something, but nope. Nada. Zilch. Boredom, if anything. The old hag didn't make me feel anything either. Do I make you feel anything? Chara asked. Oh, but of course. You were always different from the others, Chara, Floey assured them, clearly buttering them up. So you've begun to learn to feel love again, Chara replied, letting the suspicion in their voice hang in the air. Yes, of course, Floey insisted. Chara saw right through him. They'd have to work hard to keep Floey in line. Of the two of them, only Floey could absorb souls the way Asriel had once absorbed Chara's. That made him a necessary element to Chara's plot, but if he could not love, that could be a problem. An ancient human saying echoed in their head, for what shall it profit a man, if he shall gain the whole world, and lose his own soul? Godhead, said Chara, is wasted on those who cannot love. Is it? Floey asked. Don't you remember how we died, Chara? Chara nodded, gazing at their reflection in a small bedside mirror, noting the misty shroud clouding their brownish-red irises. It was not your love that held us back. It was your cowardly nature, Asriel, which prevented us from exercising our will on the world. But it was my love for the people trapped within this forgotten netherworld, that spurred us to action in the first place. And, of course, they thought to themselves, my lust for revenge. Floey craned his head to see himself better, his petals fluttering as he caught sight of his reflection and preened in the mirror. So cowardice is stronger than love, eh? Sounds right to me. It can be. Chara reached for their collar and gently threaded Floey out of their armor and away from their pendant. But it depends. Are you still a coward, Asriel? Well, Floey stammered as Chara let him wrap his stem around their fingers, you can only be so brave when you're a talking flower. Chara began to clench their hand into a fist. Floey tried to worm out of Chara's grasp as their grip tightened around his stem, his eyes widening. Do you want to do me a favor, Asriel? Chara asked as Floey cringed ingant. Sure thing, Chara. Anything for my big sibster. Chara let Floey fall to the floor. Relieved, he scrabbled against the wood floor for purchase with his naked roots and began to worm his way into a gap between two mahogany panels. Go to Snowdin, said Chara, and tell me what 2B and Nines are up to. Sometimes Nines liked to think of himself as a very clever bastard. Yoarha androids had very complex and closely guarded firmware meant to be all but unhackable, but with a calm mind, patience, about 15 minutes of uninterrupted time to concentrate, and a few frame-perfect exploits, a hacker could penetrate the firmware layer and force an android into a crippling boot loop that would take, on average, 90 minutes to auto-resolve. Nines had discovered the exploit himself. On himself. He hadn't told anybody about the exploit. Mainly because it was so difficult and time-consuming to set up that it had no combat applications. Also because if he did tell anyone, all of a sudden everyone's bodies would get a new firmware revision and then there wouldn't be an exploit anymore. This kind of very clever bastardry, Nines thought, was probably at least one of the reasons why Yorha kept having 2B kill me. Nines pulled himself out of hacking space, reached out, and pulled open 6ES eyelids. Her eyes were unfocused, her pupils contracted to black pinpricks, her irises foggy. That should hold her for an hour or two, he called back to Undyne, standing up and rolling 6ES unconscious body onto her stomach with his boot before walking out of the cell. Despite the heavy presence of Royal Guard sentry stations, the town of Snowdon had no jail. Usually, Papyrus Shed was good enough for the occasional troublemaker. Unfortunately, 6E was not the occasional troublemaker, so Undyne had set 6E up just outside of town in what the Dogi had called a garrison. It was little more than a concrete foundation and a bunch of rocks stacked on top of each other strung with bare wires stretched around the bare rock. Its single cell had bars just wide enough apart that a malnourished child could worm their way out. Fortunately, 6E was not a malnourished child. Undyne crossed her arms and clutched at her bare shoulders, her breath clouding the air. No chance she could wake up sooner, right? I don't want to keep dragging you over here every half hour until Askari gets here. Nines questioned the wisdom of keeping 6E alive. But apparently, King Askari needed to harvest the final soul from a living body. It was a ritual. A force shutdown or reboot command would snap her out of the loop, he told the captain. Anyone who's not a scanner would need a pod to grant them hacking privileges, though. Or the pod could do it itself. Undyne eyed the two pods lying inert at her feet. Nines felt a twinge of pity for the two of them, forced by their programming and Yorha protocol to adhere to 6ES commands and turn on the androids they'd been taking care of for so long. 042 and 153 were constructs bound by their programming much more strictly than any android was. Nines already missed having them around. Any chance these two could turn themselves on and do it? Undyne asked, nudging pod 153 gingerly with her foot as if afraid the slightest touch could reactivate it. The sight put a twinge through 9S's chest. Pods weren't things to be afraid of. Nines took a few seconds to think. I guess it's possible. Undyne, do you know how to build a Faraday cage? I don't know what that is. Nines rephrased the question. Does Alphys know how to build a Faraday cage? Undyne's eye lit up. Oh, yeah, Alphys knows how to build everything. She pulled out her cell phone. I'll have her over in a jiffy. Nines eyed 6ES unconscious body and felt another ripple of disgust wash through his mind. You do that. And give me a call when the prisoner wakes up. If you're going to keep her alive, I want to make the most of it. He walked out of the garrison, trying to push 6E out of his head. Nines had more important matters to attend to. 2B came to lying in a bed, Nines sitting at her side, his open black coat draped over his shoulders. He still had those silly dog-patterned pajamas on underneath it. Back at the cottage. Home. She'd never slept in this bed before. She'd always let Nines have it. The mattress was softer than she'd expected, so soft it nearly made the myriad aches from the beating she'd endured disappear. And to think, she'd thought the couch had been good enough. How long have I been out? She asked Nines, feeling an odd cottony taste pervading her mouth as she tried to will the heavy grogginess out of her head. Not long. Nines reached for the cuff of 2B's sleeve, eyeing the tattered and blood-stained fabric. Do you mind if I do what you need to? Nines rolled up the tattered sleeve covering barely, given how frayed and threadbare it had become 2B's left arm. 2B winced as his fingers brushed against bruises and burns from battle and the bone-deep laceration in her forearm still slowly oozing thick, coagulated blood. Nines let go of her. I'm not hurting you, am I, 2B? 2B nodded. I am fine. Your fingers are just cold. Oh. Sorry. Nines pulled his hands back and blew into them a few times, rubbed them together, and went back to work. How's this? Better, 2B said. Thank you. She still felt as though her head had come unscrewed. If it hadn't been for the pods. Traitor. The word stuck in 2B's mind as if she'd been branded. Part of her had always wanted to escape her responsibilities, and yet to be called what she was still hurt. She tried to clear her head. It didn't matter anymore. She was done with Yoarha. With 6E taken care of, nobody would come after her. Nines took a roll of gauze and wrapped it around 2B's arm, the rough fabric brushing against broken, tender skin and drawing a fresh ache out of her flesh. "I'm no type H, but it looks to me like most of the damage to your arm is superficial," he noted. "Nothing structural. You should be fine. Can you sit up?" 2B nodded and sat up with some difficulty, her head pounding and black box whirring, but gasped and bit her tongue as a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her abdomen. Nines steadied her, grimacing as he put pressure on his injured leg, and attended to the injury, unbuttoning and parting her bloodied shirt and noting the bruised, burned, and split skin underneath. Nines sighed as he rummaged in his satchel. "I stole some supplies from 2s and 6E, but they didn't have a lot on them," he warned 2B. "If I can't repair something, we'll have to hope Alfie's can fabricate a replacement." Running his fingers along the invisible seams on 2B's skin, he exposed her chassis and, not to 2B's surprise, found a fracture running through the shell beneath her synthetic flesh. He applied sealant to the crack, then sat back and waited for it to set. "That should do in a pinch. Mind if I hack into your systems?" he asked. "Just to make sure there's nothing wrong in here." He tapped on his forehead. 2B nodded. "Go ahead." An internal diagnostic was a smart move, especially with no pods to rely on. Nines closed his eyes, laying his hand on 2B's forehead. 2B closed her eyes as well. "Let me know if I run into anything that doesn't feel right," he told her. "Are you receiving audio properly?" "Yes." "Out of both ears?" "Yes." "Just checking." Nines went on, asking her questions every once in a while to assess her faculties. "I'm seeing some hacking artifacts in your motor centers. 2's got to you, huh?" "Yes." "Yeah, me too." "She was pretty good." Nines chuckled darkly. "Of course, she's not half the woman she used to be now. That type E you had as a teacher really taught you well, huh?" "I suppose." The diagnostic proceeded in silence, broken up sporadically with 9's inquiries until it ran its course and Nines pulled his hand away. A little shaken up, but nothing to worry about. He checked the sealant, found it dry, and closed 2B's abdomen up again. "And to think, I'd really been afraid for you." "Thank you, Nines. I'd been worried about you as well." 2B opened her eyes, sat up, and swung her legs over the side of the bed, pleased to find that there were no more knife-like pains jabbing her in the gut. "Are you hurt?" "A little scuffed up," he admitted, gingerly patting at his thigh. "Leg took a beating. But no structural damage. I'll be fine." "Is that it?" 2B laid a hand on his shoulder. "Pretty much." "So, he glanced away. "I know this is awkward, but, about that thing you wanted to tell me last night. If the core temperature of 2B's black box could have dropped below freezing, it would have." They told him. Oh, God, they told him. If only she'd been faster. If only she'd had the courage to tell him sooner. How he must hate her. 2B withdrew her hand as if she'd burned it. I'm sorry." No. She had no business apologizing. She had no business trying to mine so much as a scrap of pity from Nines after the years she'd spent murdering him. All of this. It had all been about her selfishness from the very beginning. At any point, she could have asked, no, begged to be reassigned, to have someone else deal with Nines and his insatiable hunger for closely guarded secrets. But she wanted to stay with him. Because she told herself she cared about him. She'd accepted her assignment because she cared. She'd stayed by his side because she cared. She'd pushed him away for so long until the two of them had found this sanctuary because it hurt to care. She'd told herself it was selfless of her, that she was sacrificing herself for his sake. Because nobody else who could do it would do it right, nobody else would kill him softly and make sure he didn't suffer, and if he did have to suffer then at least she would hold his hand. But wasn't it selfish of her to want him all to herself? Chara had once accused her of having a perverted sentimentality. Was that what they had been referring to? Nines snatched her hand out of the air and led it back to his shoulder. Wait. It's okay, 2B. 2B raised her head and saw mist clouding 9S's eyes, his blue eyes that were just a touch more cerulean than her own. I'm so sorry. At the sight of those eyes, those impossibly kind eyes, the floodgates burst. 2B had no choice but to bury her face in her hand to hide her tears. How could he say something so absurd? What was he doing? Was this a joke? Was he mocking her? Don't you dare pity a wretch like me, she sobbed, choking on her words. I killed you. I killed you 46 times, she pointed out, incredulous, and you're sorry for me. 2B shook her head. You must know. I could have said no. They would have just found someone else to do it, and you know it. Just, calm down and... 2B balled her fists, her fingernails biting into her palms. For some reason, the fact that Nines was being so damn understanding just made her feel worse. Her breath caught in her throat. Damn it, Nines. Take this seriously, she cried out. Dozens of versions of yourself who deserved to live just as much as you do never got the chance. And I killed every last one of them. Doesn't that make you upset? Doesn't that make you angry? 9S's fingers dug into 2B's shoulders. Of course I'm angry. That was the response 2B had been waiting for, a validation of her self-flagellation. Hearing it from Nines was almost cathartic. Of course I'm angry. But, Nines buried his face in the crook of 2B's neck, her tears hot and moist against her collar, his own shoulders quaking. Please. That's enough. I don't like seeing you like this. 2B couldn't hold back any longer. She barely had to think about the words coming out of her mouth, as reflexive as vomiting. Too bad. This is what I'm like, Nines. This is the real me. I was never your partner. I was your executioner. I'm your ARHA Unit Number 2, Type E. The line echoed in her head. I don't like seeing you like this. Of course, Nines wouldn't. 2B had never allowed herself to fall apart like this in front of him. She'd always been the stoic one, the quiet one, the serious, no nonsense, no small talk, no smiles, no laughs, no tears counterpoint to Nines and his cavalier approach to life. 2B had never been so maudlin where he could see it. To him, she must have transformed into a different person entirely, somebody alien and unknown, something to be feared. No. Shut up. Nines gripped her tighter, his tears dampening her skin as they soaked through her shirt. I don't care what you were supposed to be or what you were designed to do. You're 2B. You've never been anything else to me. Shut up. Please, 2B, just shut up. 2B laid her hand on the back of 9S's neck, her fingers brushing against his hair. She wasn't sure how to soothe him, but she wanted to just as desperately as she wanted to quell her own inner torment. She wanted to make him feel the way Toriel made her feel after all, as Nines had said, 2B was his older sister, wasn't she, but how could she help him when she couldn't help herself? Her breath came out in short, uneven, ragged gasps, her chest heaving as tears continued to stream down her cheeks. Of course I'm angry, but, not at you. It's not your fault. Nines kept her in a tight embrace, clutching her so closely it almost hurt. It's not your fault. She buried her face in his chest and kept crying, the sound of his black box whirring beneath his skin just barely audible over her sobbing, the fleece fabric of his nightshirt soft against her cheek. She didn't want to let go of him. It's okay, Nines said. It's okay. I can't imagine how much it must have hurt, to have to follow those orders. I'm sorry. 2B pulled away, swallowing what little remained of the lump in her throat, and sank back into bed, dazed and weary from her outburst. Despite the ache in her chest and the tightness in her throat that kept her breathing still shallow and her lungs still unfilled, she felt lighter, just a little, as if her sins had been a lead weight hanging from her neck. How can you be like this? She asked Nines. Nines laid down by her side, his mouth cracking into a weak but relieved smile. Hey, I'm a scanner. I was built to be insightful. 2B smiled. Sometimes, Nines admitted, his smile widening as if he and 2B were caught in a feedback loop. Too insightful, huh? You never take anything seriously, 2B scolded him. The two of them laid at each other's side until the sky outside began to darken. 2B felt herself drift in and out of consciousness many times over the next few hours, but every time she woke, Nines was still there by her side. Nines stood up, wincing as he put pressure on his left leg, and gave 2B's hand one more comforting squeeze before slipping away from her grasp. "Hey, I've got to talk to someone. You gonna be okay on your own for a little bit?" 2B nodded. "I'm fine now. Thank you." Nines. The nickname felt strange on her lips, it always had, but at last, she finally felt safe enough to use it in front of him. 2B, Nines sniffled. "Is something wrong?" Nines looked away and held his hand over his mouth. "And nothing. You're welcome, Tubes." 2B closed her eyes and drew the bedsheets around herself. 2B will suffice, Nines. Nines threw on a set of proper clothes for the first time that day, despite the fact that it was now well past noon, and hurried across the town square, the twinge from his injured leg forcing him to walk with a bit of a limp. The cold wind was like needles against his unprotected face, although the dozen or so monsters that had gathered in the center of town around the bloodstains 2B and 6E had left on the snow paid it no heed. The air did hurt a bit, but in a certain way, it was almost refreshing. He made his way to the garrison just outside Snowdon. Dogami noticed Nines as he approached, sniffing the air. "Oh. Hello, strange puppy," the dog exclaimed, ruffling 9's hair. "What can I do for you?" "Undyne told me the prisoner was awake again." Dogami nodded. "Down the hall and to the right." At Dogami's side, his wife sniffed the air as he had just done. "Captain Undyne is such a hard worker, but I don't know how much longer she can hold up in this cold." Undyne's abrasive voice echoed through the garrison. "I heard that, Dogaressa. I'll stay here all night if I have to. Watch me." Nines thanked Dogami and followed the sound of the captain's voice. Once he left them alone, the two dogs immediately went back to nuzzling noses. Undyne was sitting cross-legged beside a makeshift Faraday cage Alphys had constructed, which contained the android's deactivated support pods and 6ES sword. A ring of aquamarine lightning spears floated in the prison cell in front of her, each one's spearhead turned inward and pointed at 6E's neck. 6E was sitting in the center of the cell, whistling as if she hadn't a care in the world. Undyne spared a glance at Nines as he came in, turning her head to train her good eye on him, then went back to staring at 6E. Her yellowed fangs chattered as condensed puffs of breath poured from her mouth. Snowdon's climate, it seemed, did not suit her. As Nines approached, 6E looked away from Undyne and fixed her glare on Nines, falling silent. She smiled. "Oh, hello, Ninesy. How's 2E?" Nines bristled. "If you call her that again, I'll hack into you and turn your voice chip into a smoking lump of copper. Any chance you can shut her up again, P-punk?" Undyne stuttered through chattering teeth as she frantically rubbed her arms. "She's been whistling that same song for 15 minutes. With pleasure. I just need a few minutes alone with the prisoner first." 9's voice was as flat as he could make it, but inside he was an inferno. He wondered if this was how 2B had felt all the time, filled with such intense emotions but always hiding it behind an icy facade. It was a self-imposed hell. "Why don't you run a few laps around the garrison and thaw your legs out?" With a shrug, Undyne stood up, stretching her legs. The ring of spears circling 6E's neck dissolved into a flurry of sparks, but before 6E could move, Nines thrust his sword through the bars, the tip of the blade at her throat. "All right. If anything GG goes wrong, scream real loud, and I'll CC come running." She patted Nines on the shoulder and shuffled away, grumbling under her breath about how much she hated Snowdon. "So," said 6E, sounding awfully confident for a prisoner with a blade to her throat, "what can I do for you, Nines? Wanna know more about 2B? I bet I know her way better than you do. My friends call me Nines." Nines gritted his teeth. "You can call me 9's. We can be friends." 6E cocked her head. "My friends call me 6E. Of course, it sounds just like 6E, so it's kind of like everyone's my friend." "What kind of a lonely, miserable person would do that?" he growled. "Dunno." 6E shrugged. "So, about 2E? There's nothing you can say about 2B, Nines said, cutting her off. that I'm interested in hearing. In fact, she really does like you, 6E said. Nines fell silent. You know, beneath that icy exterior, she's just a real romantic at heart. 6E gazed into the distance. Do you know why I've been traveling with Twos? A scanner with the same personality template as her. Nines kept his sword trained on her throat. Because you miss your old friend. 6E smiled. No, silly. Twos's was a prototype. I was using her to see if I could fix 2E. Fix. Nines repeated. What do you have to fix about her? I want to make her just as cold on the inside as she is on the outside. 6E undid the clips tying back her hair, letting her whitish lilac curls hang loosely and brush against her shoulders. It's hard being a Type E. Most of us go insane after just a few months, she admitted. We have the hardest jobs in all of Yoarha, and sometimes I feel like I'm the only one who knows how to do it properly. I don't want 2E to be like one of those failures who runs away or commits suicide or erases all their memories. I want her to succeed. Like me. Nines felt a fresh wave of loathing build up inside him. You son of a. I don't want her, said 6E, to be broken. That's all. I want her to be happy. Fuck you. If she's broken, it's your fault. Nines spat, no longer able to contain himself. His free hand gripped one of the bars of the cell so tightly he could hear the metal squeak beneath his glove. Why Yuri, what's wrong with her, you goddamn? No, 9C, 6E retorted. You are. You broke her. You've made it impossible for her to do what she was built to do. You're a sick, evil person. She shook her head. You know the old saying. If you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. It's something 2E still needs to learn. With a shrug, 6E added, but I digress. What brings you here, 9S? Nines took a deep breath, reeling inwardly from 6E's cruel words. I'm here to tell you, when the barrier breaks down, he said, hiding the raging shake his voice, I'm going back to Yoarha. And when I do, he gritted his teeth and took a moment to compose himself even as he felt his temper threaten to engulf him. When I do, I'm going to kill all of you. 6E suppressed a single bark of laughter. Why you'll what? I'll slaughter you all and erase your backups. You damn Type E scum. Nines could feel his breath coming more heavily, his anger sending tremors through his hand all the way to the tip of his blade as it hung in the air just a centimeter from 6E's throat. He couldn't contain himself as thoughts of vengeance for himself, for all of his past lives cut short, and for 2B, for the sins she'd had no choice but to bear ran through his mind. Nines shuddered, tightening his grip on his sword. He swore that with this sword, with this cruel oath, he was going to save 2B. He swore to free the both of them from the chains of that horrible past, once and for all. I'll hunt you down like dogs, Nines growled. I won't stop until everyone who forced us to endure this pain has been exterminated. I'll teach you all to fear death. Every last one of you. A palpable silence permeated the cell. 6E threw her head back and laughed, toppling over and slapping her hand against the freezing concrete floor as she struggled to catch her breath. Oh, goodness me, she wheezed, trying desperately to choke down a mouthful of air before bursting out laughing anew, rolling on my floor. Oh, no. I'm so SSS scared. A scanner's gonna kill all my friends. Don't you underestimate me, Nines snarled. 6E wiped mirthful tears from her eyes. Oh, my god, 9S. All this time I thought 2B was a traitorous little bitch when it was you all along. The blade of the cruel oath bit into the concrete just centimeters from 6E's head, shearing off a lilac ringlet. What did you say about 2B? 6E sat up, wiping her eyes. I said she's a selfish, sniveling, cowardly, treasonous little turncoat in a petticoat. Every word hit Nines like a rusty nail was being pounded into his eardrums. She grinned ear to ear, deep dimples forming in her cheeks. Well? Are you going to exact your vengeance on me now? Nines heard a pair of stomping boots echo through the garrison. Undine, it seemed, had finished thawing out her legs. His little chat with 6E was coming to an end. I'm going to enjoy dancing on your grave, 6E, he said, yanking his sword out of the floor. 6E chased the last of her giggles out of her system. And when you get back to Yoarha and go on your little rampage, 9C, my backup is gonna get such a kick out of chopping you to bits before you can so much as raise your sword. You kids getting along in there? Undyne asked, brushing snowflakes out of her auburn hair as she returned to keep watch over the prison cell's contents. Nines sheathed his sword and quelled his temper. Not a scratch on her, Captain. She's all yours. Feeling unsatisfied despite his declaration, he made his way past Undyne. Hold on, kiddo. Undyne turned to 6E who hadn't quite stopped laughing at 9S and rammed the butt of her spear into 6E's forehead. 6E collapsed to the ground. We're gonna need a lot of coffee tonight, so put her back into that loop or whatever and meet me at Grillby's. A little yellow flower wormed his way through a crack in the concrete, slipping back into the semi-frozen soil below the garrison's thick foundations, burrowing underneath the town and surfacing like a submarine every so often to gauge his position. That 9S, he sure was an interesting one. Floey wondered why he hadn't taken notice of him before. Maybe he'd just been overshadowed by 2B. Or maybe he just hadn't had a chance to shine until now. But now it seemed like Nines might be a lot more promising than 2B ever had been. He had to tell Chara, but why not have some fun first? Chapter 17, See Dinner with Undyne. 2B woke up to what sounded like gunshots in the distance and felt every combat instinct programmed into her turn itself up to 11. Within seconds she'd torn herself out of bed, summoned the virtuous contract to her hand, thrown herself out the cottage's front door. In time to see a many-colored starburst fill the night sky. 2B didn't know what to make of it. Was it an attack? A missile or bomb? From whom? Machines? Androids? Some unknown third faction? Hey, Zatoiki. Captain Undyne waved at her from off in the distance. What's the matter? Never seen fireworks before, girl. The captain jogged over to 2B, clutching a thick, furry coat around her shoulders. The sky lit up again. 2B stiffened, but forced herself to calm down, as whatever danger there was here seemed to be nothing but the product of her imagination and ignorance. Fireworks, 2B repeated. Yeah. They're these things people shoot into the sky to celebrate. Celebrate? Celebrate what? Undyne grabbed 2B by the arm, breaking out in a wide and eager grin. Come on down with me and Nines to Grillby's and I'll show you. She's calling him Nines now? 2B thought. This woman who'd murdered Nines, who'd snuffed out his life so suddenly it had almost been an afterthought, was now on such good terms with him that she was calling him by his. As 2B's teeth ground the inside of her cheek, she realized she was thinking just as much of herself as she was about Undyne. The two of them, they were the same, weren't they? As Nines left the garrison and passed the dogi, he couldn't help but pick up a message coming over the radio sitting in the corner of the cramped front office. The voice coming through its tiny and primitive speakers was deep and soft, yet the radio rendered it crackly and tinny. For over a dozen millennia, tens of thousands of us have lived our lives constrained by the boundaries of Mount Ebott. Now, thanks to the hard work of Captain Undyne of the Royal Guard and her assistant, Provisional Guard in Training Papyrus, the seventh human to wander into our midst has been apprehended. Freedom is close at hand. Tomorrow, I myself will be visiting the town of Snowdon, where our hated enemy was taken prisoner, to mete out justice and collect the final soul needed to shatter the barrier. At last, at long last, the war between humans and monsters will come to an end and our people will taste liberty. Glory to monster kind. It was a familiar speech. Those same sorts of spiels were piped into the bunker about once a week from the Council of Humanity. Nines felt right at home listening to it, but also worried that perhaps King Ascari was biting off more than he could chew. The surface world was a dangerous place, after all. Maybe it would be for the best if they all stayed inside the mountain instead, where at least it was safe. Nines stepped outside the garrison and saw a sky lit up with a rainbow of lights and found himself frozen, awestruck. He'd never seen fireworks in person before. Videos and literature didn't come close to truly capturing their ghostly after-images or the faint smell of gunpowder they left in the air. They really were beautiful. All this jubilation, all this celebration. How would the monsters down here feel if he and 2B told them all how dangerous the surface was? How devastated would they be? When Nines asked himself those questions, he felt he understood just a bit better how hard it had been for 2B to say what she had said to him last night. When you knew that the truth would hurt other people, it started to hurt you, too. Nines knew Undine wanted to meet him at Grillby's for coffee, but before he headed that way, he decided to take a detour back to the cottage and check up on 2B. He needed to get the taste of his tete-a-tete with 6E out of his mouth. Oh, hey. Howdy. Nines looked down at the source of the voice and found a yellow flower sprouting out of the snow beneath his feet. It seemed familiar. You remember me, Don Ticha? The little face on the flower grinned. Nines racked his brain. Oh, yeah. That was the weird flower who'd popped up and laughed at 2B when she and Nines had first fallen into the underground. It was hard to believe that had been 2 weeks ago already. Floey, right. Floey corrected. I've been looking for you all over. You're Nines, right? Nines nodded. Who's asking? I am. Floey let out a saccharine giggle. Your friend 2B passed me by just a few minutes ago and said she was heading over to Toriel's for the night. She wanted me to find you and let you know so you wouldn't worry. Okay. Thanks, Floey. He wondered why 2B hadn't told him herself but brushed that thought aside. He hadn't told 2B where he'd been going, so it was understandable that she might not have wanted to take the time to track him down. And 2B really did seem to value the time she spent with Toriel, and vice versa. Where are you headed, by the way? Floey asked, wading through the snow while Nines headed for Grillby's. I've got to meet Captain Undine across town. Do you really want to just leave 2B alone? After all she's been through. Well, Nines stopped in his tracks. You seem to know an awful lot about me and 2B. Floey grinned, his mouth full of needle-like fangs that hadn't been there before. Ah, you finally figured me out, huh? He snarled, his voice dropping at least 2 octaves. Let's see who can get to your precious 2B first, shall we? Floey fled into the forest and Nines, gripped with panic, had no choice but to follow. Grillby's pub was, without a doubt, the warmest place in Snowdon, and it had nothing to do with the temperature inside or the eponymous bartender who was, somehow, wearing a fine black tuxedo over a body of living flame. It was the people. Every head in the pub turned when Undine walked in. Hey, everybody, she shouted out, making a beeline for the bar. So I'm sure you've all heard the good news. Everybody cheered incoherently. Well, I gotta tell ya, I'd love to take credit. Undine took a seat on one of the bar stools, leaning her elbow on the bar, and clapped 2B on her shoulder. But this girl right here did all the hard work. Let's all give her a big hand. 2B found herself surrounded by applause. She'd never felt so out of place. Completing a mission didn't normally net this kind of adulation. Your commanding officer might have told you that you did a good job, but would more likely caution you on a poor decision you'd made and urge you to do better next time. Thanks, 2B, someone sitting at one of the tables in the corner shouted out. Undine turned around, leaning on the bar with her elbows. Grillby, get me the strongest, hottest coffee and the biggest, greasiest burger you've got. 2B, what'll you have? 2B snapped back to reality. I don't require refreshment. Come on. Undine gave the barstool next to her a spin. Live a little. 2B relented and sat down. I'd like a glass of water. Get my pal here a Long Island iced tea, Grillby, Undine ordered. What is a Long Island? 2B asked. Sans waved at 2B from the other end of the bar. Well, first off, it depends on the angle you approach it from, he called out. Otherwise, it's a wide island. He downed half a bottle of ketchup, which 2B was fairly certain was not technically a beverage. 2B expected the ketchup to pour through his jaw and ribcage and spill onto his barstool, but it didn't. It just vanished. You'll like it, Undine assured her. She sloughed off her heavy coat, stretching her bare, scaly arms. Nice to get out of the cold, huh? I suppose. Undine's face fell. Okay, who died? Excuse me. Well, you're just so morose. It has been a very exhausting day. Well, exhausted or not, you should be happy. Undine picked up her cup of steaming coffee, took a sip, sighed, and closed her eye. You're a hero, you know. We're gonna sing songs and tell stories about you. Oh, and the fan art. You are gonna get so much fan art. Grillby handed 2B a tall, sweating glass of fruit-garnished liquid. 2B took it from him and promptly ignored it. You may have misjudged me, she told Undine. Undine paused to take a bite of her burger, her fangs tearing through it like a wild animal's claws, then looked 2B dead in the eye. You don't realize what you just did, do you? She asked. I've done many things. Few of them are worth being proud of. 2B took a sip of her drink out of courtesy. It was almost unbearably sweet and burned on the way down. It must have been 80% alcohol and 20% something. Somehow, drinking it made the aches of the past day fade away, even though androids weren't supposed to be affected by such chemicals. You've freed us, Undine told her, an air of reverence seeping into her voice. King Ascary's gonna come down here tomorrow to execute the human well, the android we captured himself. We'll finally have everything we need to break through the barrier and escape to the surface. And it's all because of you. Undine finished her coffee and flagged down Grillby for a refill. I wish it'd been me. But hell, seeing you fight like that. I wish I could have gotten here sooner just to watch, because what I saw was so incredible. I'm kinda jealous, but really, I don't think I mind being in your shadow. She laughed. You're definitely not the girl I thought you were. 2B took a second sip of her drink, again out of courtesy. The next sip, and the fourth one, and the fifth one was due to a desire not to offend her host, or at least, that was what she told herself. Undine checked her phone, made a note of the time, shot off a quick text, and frowned. HRM. What is it? 2B asked. Undine put away her phone. Nothing. With a strange little half-smile, she plucked a crisp golden morsel from her plate. Want a fry? A fry. A French fry. Undine wiggled it in the air. Want one? What's a French fry? It's a potato you chop up, dunk in oil, and fry. Why, you know what a potato is, don't you? You have those on the surface. I suppose. But we soldiers don't have much time for agriculture. You gotta eat, don't you? Negative. Androids are self-sustaining. Undine groaned. But, you can eat if you want to, right? There's nothing stopping me. Try it. You might like it. 2B gingerly took the fry from Undine, rolled it between two fingers. It left a glistening, greasy sheen on her fingertips she was quick to wipe off afterward, and ate it. It was incredible. Undine finished her burger and licked her fingers one by one. Go ahead. Order whatever you want. I'll pay for it. 2B shook her head. Not necessary. We have limited faculties to digest food and have little space to store what we do eat. Oh. Has nobody told you how food works, 2B? 2B looked to her left and saw Dr. Alphys climbing the bar stool beside her. And nobody's, sitting here, right? Hey, Alphys. Undine waved at her, peering over 2B's shoulder. Fancy seeing you here. What's going on? Alphys smiled uneasily. You not much. I was just getting hungry. She turned to face 2B. So, anyway, 2B, you know how we monsters are made up of dust and magic, right? About, 20% of one and 80% of the other? Well, our food's mostly magic, too. You don't digest it, your body just absorbs the magic, and, she trailed off and started to twiddle her scaly thumbs, a tinge of red coming to her lemon-yellow face. Hi, Undine. Nice to see you, too. 2B found herself occupying a sort of no-man's land between Alphys and Undine as they fired volleys of small talk back and forth. I've missed you so much. Undine leaned on her elbows, a wide and bright smile crossing her face. We never hang out anymore. Yeah, well, Alphys shrugged. Royal scientist stuff, you know. Yeah. Royal scientist, royal guard. Sure cuts into your free time when you answer to King Fluffy Buns, isn't it? King Fluffy Buns. 2B tried to interject. Still, we gotta find time to go back to the dump, said Undine. You always know how to pick the best anime. Oh, It's just so hard to find the time to get out of my lab. And on top of that, I've got to feed the, Oh, you've got a pet now? Is it a dog? Alphys cringed. Kinda. Undyne shot bolt upright, pumping her fist. I love dogs. She looked around the pub. Hey. Everyone here who's a dog, raise your paws. A few paws went up. Undyne pounded on the bar hard enough to rattle the pictures hanging from the walls. Grillby, have the Royal Guard pick up the tab for everyone who's raising their paw right now. Sans slowly raised his bony hand. Undyne pointed an accusing finger at him. Put that down, Sans. You're not getting another free meal out of me. She sat down. Dogs are the embodiment of loyalty, she sighed, waxing poetic. No one will follow your orders to the letter, rain or shine, like a dog. Friends to the end, every single one of them. 2B turned to Alphys. Doctor, would you prefer to trade seats with Alphys? Undyne called out. If you're having trouble, I'd always be willing to help dogs it. You know I'd be great at it. This went on for quite a while. Eventually, 2B decided to stop following the conversation and ordered another drink, as well as something on the menu called a hot dog, which she figured wasn't what it sounded like, given the pub's clientele. Oh, hey. 2B. Undyne called out, despite the fact that she was sitting right next to her. Yes. You were asking about King Ascari, right? Undyne asked. Oh. Yes. You called him, E.R. King Fluffy Buns. Ah, yeah. Undyne sighed. Supposedly it was his wife's pet name for him. She accidentally said it into a microphone before he could make a big speech, and he just leaned into it. To this day, everyone calls him that. The king and queen were national nose-nuzzle champions for centuries before they parted ways, Alphys added with a wistful sigh. They say there's never been a cuter couple. Damn straight. But don't let Dogami and Dogaressa hear you. Undyne talked about the king and queen like she'd been there. Hey, Alphys, she shouted out, her eye brightening. Why yeah, Undyne. Ascari's coming here tomorrow to execute 6E, right? Undyne asked, the excitement in her voice rising like the tide. Alphys nodded. Toriel lives around here, doesn't she? She looked at 2B. You know where she is, right? Undyne pounded on the table. We should get Toriel and Ascari back together, she and Alphys shouted out in unison. The lights of the city grew distant and soon vanished completely behind Nines as he ran across the snow-blanketed road that led to the ancient ruins. He didn't see any sign of that flower. Had he pulled ahead of Flowey? Or had Flowey pulled ahead of him? Nines left the valley and came to a stop at one of the rickety wooden bridges linking one frosted plateau and another, fumbling with the primitive little phone Alphys had handed him earlier that day. She'd said it had texting and even had access to the undernet as if that was something to be proud of. It was almost cute. Before he could contact Undyne, the only person other than Alphys whose number he had, he noticed a blinking icon on the phone's screen and tapped it. A text message popped up. Strongfish 91, hey Nines. I'm with 2B at Grillb's. What's taking so long? 2B was at Grillby's with Undyne. Then what the hell was Nines doing all the way out here? He shot back a quick reply. Temp username 9402 please change, sorry. Got sidetracked chasing a talking flower. I'll catch up later. Strongfish 91, prisoner okay? Temp username 9402 please change, yeah. Should have about 50 minutes before she wakes up. Strongfish 91, nice. Sorry we won't get to hang out but hey tomorrow's gonna be wild. As his breath clouded the air, Nines dug his visor out of his jacket, wrapped it over his eyes, and scanned the area, wondering why that evil flower would have brought him all this way. 9SS gaze fell on the radar in the corner of his HUD, an icon on the map slowly approaching him. A figure in black armor emerged from the forest, their pale face at first the only thing visible against the shadows. Oh, they said, a tremor of surprise playing in their voice. You're here. An android. Yo-arha. Of course 6E and 2s couldn't have been the only ones in that rescue party. Nines drew his sword and attacked. Nines, like all scanners, had not been designed for combat. Compared to a Type B, or a Type E, his muscles were weaker, his instincts more geared toward running than fighting. That didn't mean he was bad at fighting, not by a long shot. And, of course, traveling with 2B had taught him a few tricks. Nines struck the first blow, catching the android off guard, and pinned them to the ground. As he prepared to run his sword through the android's chest, he inadvertently picked up the android's IFF signal. YRHU13 TBTC 13BC13 BLRC TDSFRNLINCBIS 9SS grip slipped just a bit on his sword. Chara used the distraction to worm their way out of 9SS grasp and stood up. 9S, I presume. Hello. It's nice to see you, at last, face to F. Nines punched them in the face, knocking them back to the ground. Chara stood up, wiping a trickle of blood from their nose. Perhaps, they said, I deserved that. Perhaps. Oh, come on. Chara brushed snow off their chest with a note of irritation before making sure their nose and jaw were still in their proper places. Let's be mature adults for once, shall we? Sorry. Now that you've got a face, I just really wanted to punch it, said Nines. So, how are you, you know? Alive. Chara smirked. I stole a body. It wasn't being put to good use, anyway. And it just happened to look a little like me. Nines thought about that for about half a second before tackling Chara to the ground, ramming his sword into the ground just next to their ear, nicking their skin and drawing blood. That's what you were trying to do to 2B, wasn't it? He snarled, grabbing Chara by the throat, his gloved fingers finding the contours of their trachea. Guilty as charged, Chara gurgled, their throat muscles contracting under 9SS grip, but it all worked out, didn't it? Nines squeezed. Lighten up, they squeaked. I'm over her. Nines let go of Chara but kept his knee on their chest. You hate Yorha too, don't you? They asked him. Nines bristled. What did they mean by too? WH. Chara coughed. You see an android with Yorha armor and you instantly go into murder mode. There's a story behind that, I imagine. Might I guess it begins on a moonlit night with a girl sitting beside a boy with a sword in his chest. Nines held his hand over Chara's face. Look. I've got a lot of questions, and I'm not above hacking them out of you, and uninstalling your language packs when I'm done. Maybe you'd prefer to give me less work to do. Chara didn't need to ponder the threat. Ask away, but, let me breathe a bit more, would you? They held up their hands, palms raised. I promise I won't go anywhere. I don't think we're enemies. Nines pulled his hand away and stood up. Why did your stupid flower lead me here? Chara blinked, a look of utter surprise on their face. Why you ran into his ER, you ran into Floey? I was just heading out to look for him. Oh, what, is he your pet? A bit more complicated than that. Chara sat up. He's been gone longer than I expected. I started getting worried. Don't tell me he's a fragile little angel who'll get hurt out there on his own. Quite the opposite. He's very nasty. Chara stood up, but stood up tentatively, as if worried that as soon as they did, Nines would punch them in the face again. When it became clear that Nines wasn't going to, they grinned a sly little grin and tucked their hair behind their ears. I suppose he'll be up to some mischief in town. Why don't we go look for him together? Nines grumbled and shoved Chara in front of him, letting them lead the way back to Snowdon. He held his sword out, fully prepared to run them through should he need to. Much to 2B's relief, hot dogs had nothing to do with dogs and everything to do with a savory tube of spiced meat wrapped in a bun. She had eaten it slowly, savoring it, while Undine continued to chat with Alphys and plan their foolproof plan to reunite the king and queen. She'd also had another drink. I've got to freshen up. Undine stood up. Oh, and, 2B, you've got some mustard on your chin. 2B reached up to her chin. Other side. 2B reached for the other side. No, your other just come with me, okay? Oh. Yes. I understand. 2B promptly stood up and followed Undine. Upon entering the restroom, Undine looked around, made sure the coast was clear, and led 2B to the mirror. 2B couldn't help but notice in her reflection that there was nothing on her chin, but she'd suspected as much. Undyne checked her phone again. Just checking up on Nines. Looks like he got sidetracked with something. Yes. That sounds like Nines, 2B replied. So, Undyne lowered her voice. Sorry about, sorta ignoring you once Alphys showed up. That was my bad. It wasn't fair to you. See, I wanted to bring you here because, well, I wanted to get to know you. See the girl behind the hero, you know, before, well. There isn't much to see. I mean, look at me. When you're the toughest monster in the kingdom, people treat you like a symbol first and a person second. One day, you're a scrappy kid who just wants people to pay attention to you, the next, you're a captain and a role model and you've got all these responsibilities. Undyne set her purse on the counter. You wanna know how I got this eye patch? She brushed the hair out of her face and lifted up her eye patch. 2B was shocked to see an eye underneath that seemed more or less just as functional as Undyne's other eye. I got a dart in my eye when I was 12 and had to wear a patch for a week until it healed. But I liked it so much, I just kept it on. Undyne sighed, leaned over the sink, and took the opportunity to start reapplying her lipstick. Now, mostly I wear it to hide my power level. People underestimate you when they think you have a blind spot. Makes it way easier to humiliate bad guys who think they're hot shit. Also, I suck at getting my eyeliner symmetrical. Oh. 2B understood that Undyne was showing a very vulnerable part of herself, but given what 2B had seen of Undyne, what Undyne was capable of when she was desperate and willing to throw everything she had against a foe, the revelation that her eye patch was just cosmetic didn't have the impact Undyne probably expected it to have. Hope you weren't expecting to see a nasty gouged out eyeball or something. I was not. Undyne rummaged in her purse. Oh, hey. You're an android, so you've got really steady hands, right? 2B nodded, and Undyne promptly thrust a small pen capped with a glittering red tip into her hand. Can you, give it a shot? 2B hesitated as her fingers closed around the pen. Once more she instinctively replayed that horrible scene from the timeline she'd erased in her mind's eye. The empty, blank look on 9SS face as he'd fallen to the ground with one of Undyne's spears rammed all the way through his head. The way he'd looked at her with a single unseeing eye, the life already drained from his body. But she couldn't remember the way she'd felt at that moment quite as clearly anymore. She couldn't recall just how deep her stomach had dropped, just how fast her black box had whirred, just how tight her throat and chest had become. The trauma, it felt distant instead of immediate, blunt and soft-edged instead of sharp, less like a memory and more like a nightmare. Like the nightmares Nines was having about his many deaths. The memory had become numb, the scar tissue on a long-since-healed wound. 2B bit her lip. She wasn't starting to like Undyne, was she? How could she? Because Nines still likes you, she told herself, after what he went through. After what you did to him. Is it so hard to bury the hatchet when this Undyne has been nothing but helpful to you? After a pause that lingered so long that it nearly felt like an eternity, 2B acquiesced, leaned in, and did her best to match what Undyne had done to her right eye, drawing a swooping crimson curve across the edge of her left eyelid that caught the light and glittered against her blue scales. Undyne looked at herself in the mirror, admiring 2B's handiwork. Ah, yeah. This is beautiful. She replaced her eye patch, grinned, and offered the pen to 2B again. How about you try this out? It'd look great on you. That won't be necessary. Try it out, Undyne cajoled her. 2B handed the pen back to Undyne. Thank you for offering. Undyne's fins drooped, crestfallen, but she begrudgingly packed her makeup away. All right. Well, thanks for helping me out. And, one more thing. A twinge of paranoia ran through 2B's mind. There wasn't anything she was hiding from Undyne, but after the events of the past day and with 6ES interrogation still fresh in her mind, 2B couldn't help but feel nervous. I didn't expect Alphys to come here. Not that that's a bad thing. She's really great. I've always she's smart and she's so passionate, and even though she's kind of a train wreck sometimes she puts 100% into everything I'm really glad her and I hit it off again, but, I kind of, Undyne looked away and mumbled something. What was that? I brought you here today to you. 2B took a second to parse the rushed jumble of words. You brought me here to date me, she repeated, just to make sure she'd heard right. Of course. Undyne had been behaving almost coquettishly toward her this entire night. 2B should have noticed sooner, but 2B often found she had trouble paying attention to Undyne's body language. In her mind's eye, all too often when she looked at Undyne she saw only the captain's face twisted in fury, righteous as it might have been as it had been during her forgotten first encounter. She couldn't see that now. What she could see was a girl who seemed, of all things, apprehensive, even shy around her no matter how boisterous the captain normally was. Why yeah. And before Alphys and I start our date, I figured it'd only be fair if I finish yours. Undyne's face fell. In fact, it all but hit the floor. Please tell me, she moaned, desperately clutching 2B's shoulders. Tell me you still have dates on the surface, 2B. Not me, personally, 2B said. She thought about her assigned operator, 60, and the number of times 2B had found herself inadvertently helping her get over a bad breakup. Some of my more outgoing comrades, though. Undyne laughed and awkwardly withdrew one hand. Well, it's good that you android super soldiers haven't all forgotten how to have fun up there. But, yeah. There's one thing. One thing I kinda wanted to do tonight. One thing I'd kinda like to do while I still have the chance. If it's okay with you, of course. Undyne didn't continue. She just looked at 2B, her mouth slightly agape, her scaly cheeks a little flushed, looking just a little lost. You'd like to kiss? 2B guessed. What? I don't. Undyne quickly looked back at the mirror, then just as quickly looked in the opposite direction. How do you know? I am stoic, not an idiot. 2B lifted her hand to brush Undyne's hand off her arm, but paused when her fingertips brushed against Undyne's scales. The captain's hand was shaking just slightly, and as 2B felt that tremor, she lost her nerve to deny her request. Make it quick, she told Undyne. Undyne was taken aback, her eye widening in surprise, but regained her composure in a flash. Really? She let a faint smile split her lips. Well, here goes nothing. Undyne darted in and pecked 2B so quickly, so furtively, that 2B almost wouldn't have noticed save for the brief electric tingle playing on her lips and a slightly fishy smell in her nostrils as the captain backed away from her, ending a moment as ephemeral as it had been awkward. 2B felt her black box's temperature tick up by just a few degrees. With a blush and a glance back and forth, Undyne sighed and cleared her throat. Sorry. I gotta dump you now. She shrugged. Plenty of sexy fish in the sea, hope we can still be friends, etc. 2B drew Undyne's hand off her arm. It was really amazing how much difference a first impression could make. The first version of Undyne she'd met would never have behaved like this around her, and 2B herself, in fact, never thought she'd find herself acting like this around any version of Undyne. Well, Captain, 2B said, I must say you are the oddest person I have ever dated. Undyne chuckled as she led 2B out of the restroom. 2B, you're not even in my top 10 weirdest dates. 2B, Undyne, and Alphys left the pub together after another round of drinks and a spirited conversation about swords. Finally, something 2B felt qualified to talk about. Undyne, nearly vibrating from all the caffeine she'd ingested, insisted on walking 2B home even though 2B had made it very, very clear that androids did not metabolize alcohol. So, said Alphys as the three of them walked over trampled and trodden snow, eyeing the sword sheathed at 2B's side. Reverse blade katanas aren't a thing. No, 2B insisted. They would be hilariously impractical. But all you have to do is make the other side sharp and it would not work. Not even for a remorseful ex-samurai looking to escape his blood-stained past, no. 2B wondered if Alphys had been talking about that particular anime on purpose. But Undyne reached down and ruffled Alphys' head spikes. Don't listen to her, Alphys. I mean, what does 2B know about swords, anyway? Everything, replied 2B. You know, I'm actually really glad Nines didn't show up. Undyne chirped. I haven't had a girls' night out in, like, forever. Let's do this again tomorrow, okay? 9S was supposed to join us. 2B asked. She'd been at Grillby's for what had felt like nearly 2 hours, and during all that time he'd been indisposed? A spark of paranoia flitted between her synapses. Why didn't he? Got sidetracked chasing a flower or something? Undine pulled out her phone. Keep your shirt on. Got a text from him about 20 minutes ago saying he's on his way back. Chasing a flower? Alphys asked, swallowing hard. I gotta get back to the prisoner before she wakes up again. Undine sighed and slipped her phone back into her purse. 2B, wanna come with me and shout insults at her or something? Excuse me. Undine shrugged. I heard you two kinda had a history. Might make you feel better. I shout at things that hurt me all the time. It's therapeutic. 2B had to admit, the prospect seemed appealing. And so she found herself agreeing to it, and the three of them made their way to the garrison where 6E was being held. The sentry station was silent save for the primitive radio still blaring the latest obnoxious pop hit by Met Adden through its wheezy speakers. Undine rolled her eye. Don't tell me the doggy took a coffee break, too, she sighed. With another glance at her phone, she added, at least we've still got about 10 minutes before 6E wakes up. 2B ventured deeper into the building while Undine mumbled and complained, every step she took drawing her lungs tighter and tighter. To say she had a bad feeling about this place was an understatement. It didn't take long for her to reach the empty prison cell, the blown-apart bars, the mangled remains of a ramshackle Faraday cage littered with yellow flower petals strewn across the scorched concrete floor. Undine and Alphys weren't far behind. With mounting horror, Alphys lifted her boot and found its sole coated in a thin layer of grey dust. She blanched. Oh my god. Undine stared ahead, just as frozen in her shock as 2B, and for the first time that night, was utterly speechless. Floey watched 6E dash into the deep, dark forest and vanish in the shadows between the trees with great amusement. Back in the old days, when he'd had the power to reset time, he'd learned the whole underground backward and forwards. Its every inhabitant's every action and reaction. He'd done everything this world had to offer. He'd read every book. He'd burned every book. He'd won every game. He'd lost every game. He'd appeased everyone. He'd killed everyone. He hadn't known what to do next. Life was boring. And then 2B had appeared and stolen that power from him. But she and her dear nines hadn't made things much more exciting, or at least, not for long. In fact, they'd somehow made things worse. And even with Chara here, they weren't making things exciting fast enough. Honestly, Floey was feeling really disappointed with his sibling. But now a real freak was here in the underground, and finally, at long last, things were interesting. So much more interesting. And as for Chara, they were going to learn soon enough just how valuable that love of theirs was. Chapter 18, See Heartache, Part I. The silence permeating the empty garrison did not last long. Undine kicked the mangled and torn-apart Faraday cage, swearing up a storm, while 2B climbed over what remained of the prison cell's bars and knelt in the center of the cell. 2B recalled inflicting a few bloody wounds on 6E, one in her shoulder and one through her torso, and while neither was fatal, neither injury had been repaired. 6E had been patched up rather inexpertly by the guards keeping watch over her, as nobody here was accustomed to working on synthetic life forms. Those wounds had opened up again when 6E had made her escape, as evidenced by the few spatterings of blood dotting the floor. There was an ear-splitting crash as Undine threw the mangled cage against the wall. Damn it! What was I thinking? I'm dead in the water. All this because I wanted to get into a hot android chick's. Quiet, 2B barked at Undine. While Undine may have held the rank of captain in this kingdom's royal guard, 2B could tell that she was a peacekeeper, not a soldier. She hadn't had the experiences 2B had that made it so easy to quiet her emotions in high-stress situations. The kingdom was too small, too quiet, too well insulated from the existential threats roaming the earth. 2B did her best to remain cool and collected despite the 1,000 nightmare scenarios buzzing through her head at that very moment. It had always been a gift of hers to put on a stoic face for the sake of those around her, no matter how dire the situation. Only a few things in the world could break her. She forced her fear down to an imperceptible tremor in her clenched fist. 2B stood tall and stared right through Undyne. "Captain, if you feel mentally unequipped to fulfill the duties of your position, then I would rather you take orders from me." "Hey," Alphys interjected, coming to Undyne's defense, "you can't pull rank on her, she's the cap." Undyne shook her head. "No, I've got this." "Thanks, 2B. Those high-def android eyes picking up anything?" she asked 2B. 6E is bleeding, 2B explained. "There is damage to her internal systems. She cannot travel at top speed, and what's more," she pointed at the bloodstains with the tip of her shoe, "she will be leaving behind a trail." "She also has 2 pods with her," 2B reminded herself, just to quell that little spark of optimism she'd lit, "and a head start." She reached into her pocket, withdrew her visor, and wrapped it over her eyes. Her HUD popped up, overlaying her field of vision with basic diagnostic information. Without Pod 042 at her side, 2B wouldn't have access to long-range scans, but the radar in the corner of the HUD could still pick up black box signals within a 15-meter radius. Between that and the trail of blood, hunting down 6E wouldn't be impossible. "How do you see through that?" Alphys asked. 2B ignored her. "Undyne. Give me your phone." "What?" Undyne asked, shocked at the brazen request. "Your phone. Give it to me." Shrugging, Undyne pulled out her phone, and 2B immediately snatched it out of her hand. She hated to do this, but again, without their pods, 2B and 9s were very limited in their capabilities, long-range communication being one thing denied to them. She scrolled through Undyne's contacts. They all had stupid pseudonyms and sorted by date to find what she hoped was whatever number Undyne had been using to contact 9s. 2B held the phone up to her ear as it rang. "You don't have to frog march me all the way to town," Chara protested as 9s frog marched them all the way to town. They drew closer to one of the bridges crossing the many deep ravines winding across the snowy environment. Off in the distance, in a gently sloped snowy valley, the distant lights of Snowdon grew just slightly closer and brighter as they peeked through the landscape. 9s prodded them in the small of their back as gently as he could with his blade. Yeah, he muttered. "One affirmation will suffice, 9s, Chara replied, repeating a common response from 2B. 9s's proverbial hackles rose hearing it. "You're not doing yourself any favors," 9s said, "with that attitude of yours." "I'm sorry. It's simply in my nature. As much as it's in your nature to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Chara glanced over their shoulder at 9s. "Speaking of, don't you have some questions for me? You might as well ask them now that you've taken me prisoner." "All right, then. Tell me what a Type C is." "It's not any model of android I've ever heard of." "And how could you be with Yoarha if you died hundreds of years ago?" "One at a time, please." Chara held up their hand. "For your first question. Would it surprise you, 9s, if I told you that we androids suffered from a devastating lack of unity for the past several millennia? That we were broken up into factions, dozens of them at some points, all working at cross purposes, often hindering our efforts to drive off the invaders infesting the Earth? That it was because of this lack of unity that a war to repel the machines degenerated into merely a struggle to survive them?" The theory seemed reasonable enough. As 9s had been told time and time again, the resistance had been on the back foot since practically the start of the machine wars, and only with the formation of Yoarha had the machines started to lose ground. Type C, character. Infiltration and sabotage. Your type was designed to infiltrate and destroy these factions, 9s summed up. Bingo. One of the most devastating afflictions of our kind was the ennui brought on by the disappearance of our human masters, you see, and... Hey, wait a minute. They didn't disappear, 9s insisted. They fled to the moon after the first machine war in the 51st century. As the words left his mouth they felt wrong, as if in his soul he knew they weren't correct. But that was impossible. The Council of Humanity commanded Yoarha from the moon base, and that was a fact. Transmissions came from the lunar server to the bunker at regular intervals, assuring androids around the world that the tens of thousands of humans seeking refuge in orbit around the Earth were still cheering them on. But then, why did he have this strange feeling, as if he knew that wasn't the whole truth? That is common knowledge now, Chara said, but it was not always so. In the 6,000 years that followed the First War, the truth regarding humanity became muddled and unclear. With scarce historical records, some of us grew to believe that our human masters had been eradicated by the alien manifestation. Some believed they had burrowed underground, hollowing out the earth and leaving us to eke out our lives alone among the enemy on the surface. Others believed that humanity had gone extinct thousands of years earlier, in the early decades of the 21st century. All variations on a common theme. Running through all of these heresies was one common thread: our masters, our creators, our gods, had either died or left us to fend for ourselves. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Then your job was to kill the heretics, yes. To proclaim the one true gospel of humanity. Chara spread out their arms as they continued to walk in front of Nines. While the organization that would eventually become Yoarha and the Council of Humanity developed and perfected the black box technology you and I now bear, prototypes such as myself were sent out to pave the way for our arrival. We would sneak into communities spreading falsehoods and break them down from the inside. The job of Type CS was to pass along false intel and engage in other forms of subterfuge, goading the leaders of problematic resistance cells into engagements with the enemy that would inevitably become suicide missions, turning victories Pyrrhic and defeats total. If need be, we were also assassins, as well, although we preferred the subtle touch. Nines couldn't help but think about his own relationship with 2B. 6E had told him that Type ES had been designed to purge Yoarha of inconveniences, and it had always been an open secret that Type ES often disguised themselves as other models in order to hide in plain sight among their targets. That had been exactly what 2B had done to him. Just as Type A models had been the precursors to Type BS, it seemed these archaic Type CS had evolved into executioner models, like 6E. Nines found himself hanging onto Chara's every word but never lost sight of the tip of his blade as it hovered centimeters away from a gap in their armor. The question he now had on his mind was Chara more in the vein of 6E and her ilk, a horrible, ghoulish sociopath who reveled in the carnage they left behind, or were they more like 2B, racked with guilt and self-loathing over their deeds? At first, we erased major heresies from the cultural consciousness, said Chara. But as the various schools of thought dwindled, I found myself aiding in the destruction of rival organizations to what would eventually become the Yoarha, organizations which sought the same goal through different means. Erasing fellow androids whose beliefs were not so different from my own, turning on people I had once called friends. As their feet reached the edge of the ravine and their right boot landed on the first slat of the wooden bridge, Chara stopped. Nines nearly kept going, and if his attention had lapsed he'd have inadvertently driven his sword into their back. As I've learned, you see, there is no such thing, they said, turning slowly to face Nines as they stood on the precipice, as an absolute enemy. As the whims of our leaders change, so too do the victims of our violent delights. As I am sure you and 2B understand quite well, a friend today could be a foe tomorrow, and when you are a soldier, you have no say in the matter. Chara reached out, laying a finger on the blade of 9SS sword, and gently pushed the cruel oath aside. And just as today's ally can be tomorrow's enemy, so too can an enemy become an ally. I can't believe this prick, Nines thought. Do they really expect me to be their pal now? We androids were built to protect and carry out the wills of our human masters. The same humans who waged a war on these monsters, imprisoned them down here, and forgot about them. But are these monsters our enemies? They stepped closer. We might be cut off from the bunker, but we still know Yoarha's mission statement. If we could receive orders from command right now, I'm sure they'd recommend we neutralize them, just like the machines. Those last words sounded familiar, but Nines couldn't recall ever hearing anybody say them to him. Almost as if he'd heard them once in a half-remembered dream. But you and 2B have made friends here, haven't you? Chara smiled. If the barrier fell tomorrow and you got back in contact with Yoarha, if your commander gave you the orders to exterminate these creatures for the glory of mankind, would you obey them? No, Nines replied immediately. Just a week ago, before he'd learned what he now knew about his place within Yoarha, he might have had to hesitate a bit before answering, but Nines was sure that no matter what, his answer would still be a resounding no. As I said, Chara concluded, raising their hands, I don't think we're enemies. Is there anything else you'd like to know? Nines had one more question, but before he could ask it, the phone in his pocket began to buzz. Hold on. He pulled out the phone, flipped it open. The call was from Undyne, by the looks of it, and held it to his ear. I've got to take this. To his surprise, it was not Undyne's but 2B's voice that came through, crackling and tinny through the phone's speaker. 9S. This is 2B. 6E has escaped. She'd purged any hint of emotion from her voice, as she tended to do in these situations, but given her history with 6E, 9's figured 2B was doing everything she could to maintain her stoic facade. Return to town immediately, and 9's could hear her voice hitch and felt the need to reassure her. 2B, it's going to be. If you run into 6E, do not engage her. 2B said it in her stern, don't you dare do anything stupid, tone of voice. Got it. I'll be there as soon as I can, 2B. Take care. 2B disconnected, leaving 9's holding a silent phone. 9's shot a suspicious glare at Chara. So? You think you're pretty clever, huh? Chara blinked. I suppose. 9's flung out his hand, hacked Chara, and brought them to their knees, deadening the joints in their legs. First, your flower pal lures me all the way up here. Then I run into you, and while that little yellow creep is springing 6E out of jail, you slow me down with your grandiose conspiracy mongering. Chara staggered to their feet and drew the sword hanging at their back, a curved, wicked Type 40 sword, one of the latest models, just in time to block 9's blade. You're working with 6E, aren't you? 9's cried out. Who? 9's pressed onward, not buying Chara's denial for a second. This Type C. This body-stealing, pretentious creep, they represented everything 9's was starting to loathe about Yorha. His animosity spurred him on, his strikes as furious as they were calculated. Did a single word I said penetrate the thick skull of yours? Chara snarled, locking 9's blade between two short butterfly daggers and planting their boot squarely in 9's abdomen and knocking him to the ground. 9's rolled across the ground, tearing the coating of snow blanketing the soil, and scrambled to his feet, snow sloughing off his coat. Listen, Chara said, wiping their chin, I know you hate your masters. Perhaps even as much as I do. Join me, and... Oh, give it up, Chara. Can't you see he's got you figured out, pal? It was a high-pitched, saccharine voice ringing out from the other side of the bridge, the kind of voice only a talking flower could speak in. Floey poked his petal-ringed face out from behind one of the wooden stakes holding the bridge up on the opposite side of the ravine. 9's is an awfully smart boy. We can't pull the wool over his eyes. He drew out his words with sinister satisfaction, the way one would savor a meal. Time to admit we failed. Our mistress will be most displeased. Chara looked back and forth between Floey and 9's, and seeing the confusion in their eyes as they darted back and forth, 9's started to think that perhaps he'd been quick to judge them. 9's stuck his hand in his pocket, fumbled for his phone, and tried as surreptitiously as possible to dial Undyne. A tinny voice 9's tried his best to muffle emerged from his coat pocket. Undyne's. He'd been hoping 2B would have picked up again, but this was better than nothing. 9's? Hey, buddy, what's going on? That's right. We lured you here, released 6E as per her request, Floey gloated, climbing up the post, and pointed her in the direction of a certain monster of royal blood while the path was clear. Once 6E has finished collecting her soul, we'll be done with this world. Mother. Chara gasped, their eyes wide. With an accusing finger jabbed at Floey's direction, they shouted out, how could you, Asriel? She's your mother, too. That flower is Asriel? How? 9's thought. Alphys told us his soul had been anchored to that machine's body. But this shocked musing was drowned out by a far more pressing concern, 6E, she's going after Toriel. He spoke loudly enough that the phone should pick it up, even with his finger muffling the speaker. I had to do it, Chara, Floey said, grinning. After that shameful display back at Mom's little hovel, I decided you needed to be taught a lesson. He curled his stem around the top of the post. When I came back to life, I modeled myself on you. It was the only thing that kept me sane in this miserable, soulless existence I've been trapped in. But you're not behaving like the Chara I know. The one I remember. Where is the Chara who laughed at the pain they caused? Who never cared about anybody but themselves? When did they get replaced with a maudlin sap? Abominable weed. Chara snarled, tearing across the bridge. Nines ran after them. From the looks of it, Floi was the real enemy here. He'd misled and used both Nines and Chara. It seemed Chara might have had a point after all. Betrayal made strange bedfellows. With a wide, toothy smile, Floi spewed a salvo of magically conjured bullets through the air, chewing through the rope bridge. As the bridge buckled and sagged, its rope supports snapping, it tore away from the ravine, the marginally stable wooden slats beneath 9SS feet becoming as unstable as thin air. Asriel! Chara shouted out, their anguished, betrayed howl vanishing against the howling of the wind through the ravine, the rushing of the river below growing louder and louder as Chara fell through the air with Nines. You came back wrong, Chara. Floi cackled. The heartache you feel is the cost of your love. Nines reached out for his pod 153 was always there for him to use as an impromptu glider in situations like these, only to remember that pod 153 was no longer at his side. Instead, his hand curled around one of the severed ropes drifting through the air and latched onto it, the rough, braided fibers scraping against his leather gloves as he gradually came to a halt, grasping with all his might to stay above the rushing water below. Chara fell past Nines and threw out their hand, grabbing Nines by his free arm and pulling him down further. The two finally came to a stop with only a few centimeters of rope left. At the same time, they hit the side of the ravine wall, the impact knocking the wind out of Nines and sending a wave of noise through his visual processor. The phone fell from 9SS coat pocket and tumbled into the rapids below, gobbled up by the ravenous current. Nines looked down. Chara looked down, too, then looked back up at him. They were panting, their eyes wide and wild. "See, can these newer models swim?" they asked. "Not easily," Nines answered. "Water was difficult for androids to master. Not that swimming was difficult. All of the various strokes and techniques were well within the realm of possibility for an android, but their bodies lacked buoyancy. Androids swam like rocks, and sank like them, too." "Centuries of innovation," Chara grumbled, looking back down at the river, "and nothing to show for it." In the dark, Nines spied the telltale pale spots of ice floes drifting down the black river. If he let go, timing his fall just right, he could land on one of them and drift downriver, but it would be risky. If he missed, he'd end up at the bottom of the river and at the mercy of its currents. But what good would that do? Nines only had two options: head toward town and rendezvous with 2B, then head off in pursuit of 6E, or double back to the ruins and get Toriel to safety. This river didn't seem to be connected to the one that ran past Snowdon, so dropping into it wouldn't bring him into town, and the other side of the ravine was currently inaccessible. This ruled out his first course of action, so all Nines could do was find Toriel and keep her safe. Keep her safe for 2B. Nines knew that 2B and Toriel had grown close. A blind man could see the way the old queen in exile doted on 2B. And although 2B tended to hold her emotions as close to her chest as she could, Nines could see that she reciprocated Toriel's affection in her own way. Nines liked her, too. The three of them were a bit like a family, something he couldn't let 6E destroy. He couldn't let Yorha keep taking. Not from 2B. Not from him. He looked back up to the top of the ravine. There was about a 15-meter climb to the top, doable, but not with one arm. "Chara, how about you let go of my arm? Grab onto my legs so I can climb up." Chara carefully relocated to 9SS legs, freeing his arm and allowing Nines to grasp the rope more securely. Nines took a deep breath and began his ascent, hauling himself up only a few centimeters at a time thanks to the weight hanging from him, the rough ropes grinding against exposed skin on his palms where his gloves had worn away. "Come on, 2B. Please tell me you and Undine heard all that. Please tell me you two know where to go." As Nines climbed up, an indistinct shadow glided across the ravine, its passage slow and all but invisible against the sky until it landed. And 6E's smiling face popped over the edge of the ravine, illuminated by the floodlights provided by her pods. The light shone directly into 9SS face, blinding him for a fraction of a second until his visor automatically compensated. 6E was crouched over the dangling rope Nines was clinging to, both Pod 042 and Pod 153 hovering over her shoulders. "Oh, Nines. Fancy meeting you here." She reached down and grabbed the rope. "You aren't using this, are you?" 2B and Undyne had heard everything, and 2B wasted no time hurrying along that well-traveled path out of the valley and up into the forested plateaus which led back to the ruins. Undyne trailed behind her, huffing and puffing in the frigid, wintry air as she struggled to keep up with the android's sprinting speed. The flashlight held in her hand illuminated the snow in front of 2B, making the churned-up white snow glitter and the dotted trail of blood marring its surface shine. 3 black box signals entered the periphery of 2B's radar, all clustered together straight ahead. None of them were moving. 3. 2B wondered, the unexpected head count filling her with a new sense of dread. 9s, 6E, and, who? One of the ravines separating one plateau from another drew closer as the trees thinned out. The boot prints tearing up the snow grew farther apart as they approached the sheer precipice, the bloodstains heavier. 2B was not an expert tracker, but it didn't take an expert to see that 6E had begun to run at this point, and as 2B came closer, she saw why. The rope bridge had collapsed, plummeting into the river running through the ravine. Lights from the 2 pods under 6E's command fell on a single rope that hung from the opposite side and the silver-haired boy hanging from it, another figure 2B didn't recognize dangling from his legs. 9S. 9S's head whipped around at the sound of her voice. 2B, he called out, his voice echoing across the ravine. The rope jolted. 2E. It's about time, old friend. Undyne's flashlight traveled up in a wide arc, centering on the other end of the ravine, further illuminating a pale-skinned, pale-haired android clad in patches of black armor, blood smeared over patches of exposed skin. 6E lifted the rope she held in her left hand, grimacing theatrically and reaching up to her bleeding shoulder. I wasn't sure how long I could keep waiting for you. My arm. I can't hold on to this rope much longer. Let him go. Undyne shouted out. 6E smiled. Are you sure? Captain, I urge you to rephrase that, 2B hissed. Don't worry about me. 9s shouted out from his precarious position as 6E let the rope slowly slip from her blood-slicked fingers. She's just trying to keep you from going after her. 2B, you have to. 6E let go, and 9s was cut off by a scream as he plummeted to the bottom of the ravine. Oops. She stood up, her pods turning to face the other side of the ravine, momentarily blinding 2B until her visor polarized itself. You know, 2E, if you hadn't hurt my shoulder, I'd have been able to hold on longer. 2B ran to the edge of the cliff, nearly throwing herself off it, staring down into the inky blackness blanketing the ground far below, hoping to discern black from ebony. 9s, she cried out, desperately hoping her companion, her brother, had landed safely. See you on the other side, 2E. 6E shouted with a laugh as she stumbled off, clutching her side as her wound left a fresh trail of speckled blood across the snow. She's using 9s to keep you from catching up to her, 2B told herself, trying to quell her rising anger at 6E. It was an obvious tactic to stall her, and damn it, it was working. Captain Undyne, what's the quickest path down? Undyne patted her on the shoulder. Let me worry about 9s. There's another bridge about 100 meters south of here. 2B nodded. She knew what she had to do, that she had to catch up to 6E, but if 9s was okay, she wanted to be the first to know. And if he was hurt, she wanted to be the first person who came to his aid. And if he was dead? Undyne picked up on 2B's moment of hesitation. Look, she said. I don't know Queen Toriel as well as you do. Obviously, you care a lot about her. Sure, she may be the coward queen, but she's still royalty, and, she lifted her eye patch and handed a spare flashlight to 2B. I've got to do one thing right today. You're a lot faster than me, so if anyone can catch up to 6E, it's you. Understood. 2B saluted, holding her hand over her chest as if by instinct in the Yoar-Ha salute she knew so well. Glory to the oath nearly slipped out through sheer force of habit. Take care of 9s, Captain. 2B took off for the other bridge, glancing over her shoulder to see Undyne heading in the opposite direction. As she ran along the edge of the cliff, the snow crunching beneath her shoes, the light from her flashlight bouncing across the ground in front of her, 2B hoped she was doing the right thing. It was still such a strange feeling to have that hope, that uncertainty, that fear that your choice might prove to be wrong, even when one was spurred into action. As soon as the rope had gone slack, 9s had driven his sword into the sheer rock wall, thankful that his NFCS could call his weapon into his hand in an instant. It had slowed his fall to a halt, and now he dangled from the cliffside just as he had been doing a few seconds earlier, only now he had no way up. Chara hadn't been so lucky. Once 6E had let go of the rope, they'd lost their hold on Nines and plummeted to the ground like a stone. Nines glanced up at the other side of the ravine and saw two flashlights bobbing in opposite directions, wondering which would come to his aid, and looked back at the ground. He could make out some faint details on the riverbank below. He wasn't very high up anymore. If he fell to the ground at this height he'd land relatively safely. He hoped. Slowly and with trepidation, Nines let go of his sword and fell. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the riverbank, his cheek pressed against the cold, wet, water-smoothed stone. He'd broken the fall with his legs, one of which was now being tugged along by the river like a very large bone being dragged by a very small dog. Nines pulled himself away from the river and rolled onto his back, then sat up, ignoring the sharp, shooting pain running up his left calf and thigh. "Chara," he called out, looking around to try and discern shapes in the darkness. "You're being awfully laconic." An indistinct form, sable on onyx, struggled to sit up before collapsing. "My brother," they muttered, dazed, "is gone. Whatever that thing is, it isn't him. Friends today, enemies tomorrow, huh?" Nines stood up, favoring his leg. It was the same leg he'd injured earlier that morning when he'd fought with 6E and 2s, of course, and limped toward Chara. Somehow, he felt he understood them better, although they were still a loathsome, body-stealing creep. "Should I tell them?" he asked himself. "About the other Asriel we found?" Chara looked up at Nines, their maroon eyes shining faintly in the dark. As 9's eyes adjusted to the night, details jumped out at him, namely, the blood coating the side of Chara's face and what looked like a rock lodged in their head. "I came back," they whispered. "Why couldn't he? Why not my dear brother?" The light faded from Chara's eyes and Nines noticed with faint shock the black box signal on his radar vanishing from his HUD. Nines wasn't sure what it felt like to mourn someone after all. As far as he'd known, Yorha's backup system had rendered him and his comrades functionally immortal. Out of everybody in Yorha, 2B and her kind alone knew what it meant to be mortal, having inflicted mortality on their peers so often. Yet Nines found himself holding his hand over his chest in a silent salute, a salute to an android who'd been forced into the same line of work as 2B and had harbored the same resentment toward their masters that Nines now felt. 2B dashed through the forest, darting through gaps in the trees on a direct course to the ruins. She wasn't on any trail or road anymore, a disadvantage compared to 6E, but at least she could run at full speed. All she had to do was head west at a slight northward angle, and God willing, she could still head 6E off. Toriel Dreamer was beyond the shadow of a doubt the kindest person 2B had ever met. And the first time 2B had met her, she had regarded the old woman with nothing but suspicion and killed her without a second thought. Because she had been different. Strange. Because 2B hadn't known what she'd been dealing with or what kind of world she'd become a part of. Now that 2B had gotten to know Toriel, now that she knew what a kind and caring person the Queen in Exile was, 2B couldn't bear to lose her. Almost as much as she couldn't bear to lose Nines. 6E stood in front of the great stone door, her armor pulled off in asymmetric patches. She was doing her hair back up in twin pigtails, wrangling the thickly curled silvery lilac locks and whistling. 6E had always liked to look her best before, during, and after a kill. The android laid a hand on the door, her other hand reaching to grab the Oda key floating at her back. 2B thanked her lucky stars she wasn't too late. She'd made it in the nick of time. With a hoarse shout, she drew her sword and met 6E's blade, the two of them grappling in the darkness. 2E. You've made it. 6E used the long blade of her Oda key to force 2B away. 2B dug in her heels as she locked her blade against 6E's and stood her ground. While 14E had excelled with the Oda key, it had been due to years of careful mastery. 6E did not use the sword the same way its original owner had, and did not take proper advantage of its length. Longer was not always better often, longer was unwieldy and inconvenient. For all the times 2B had lost in practice duels against 6E, that Oda key had never bitten into her side while in 6E's hands the way 14E had commanded it. 2B used her shorter range to her advantage, placing herself between the door and 6E and driving 6E back as their swords ground together. I thought you'd take a lot longer, 6E taunted 2B. How's 9's? 2B said nothing as she pushed herself against 6E's strength, her blade sliding along the length of the Otaki as she forced 6E to dig in her heels. Oh. Don't tell me you didn't go after him. 6E put on a face of exaggerated faux concern. Whatever happened to the bond you two shared? As 2B came closer, 6E twisted her sword and caught the side of her neck. It was a shallow cut, but it still bled profusely as the steel blade slid across it. Before the blade could remove her head, 2B tucked in her legs and rolled across the ground, sweeping out her leg to catch 6E's ankles. 6E buried her sword in the ground, leaped into the air to avoid 2B's sweeping kick, and pivoted around the sword before coming to a landing and withdrawing the Otaki from the ground. 2B was shocked at the display of agility. 6E was still bloodied from her injuries. She should have been effectively hobbled, easy to kill. But of course, 2B had always underestimated 6E at her own peril. Metal rang against metal as the slender blade of the virtuous contract locked against 6E's long Otaki. Straining her arms against 6E's superior upper body strength, 2B wrenched the blade aside with a desperate parry. Maneuvering around 6E, she spun in a vicious pirouette, her lashing foot connecting with her opponent's wrist and knocking the Otaki out of 6E's hand. Before 6E could summon it back to her hands, 2B swiped the sword out of the air, holding it in her offhand as she swung her virtuous contract. 6E ducked, the blade just grazing her hair, and retaliated by driving her knee into 2B's face. 2B fell to the ground, blood pouring from her nose as she picked herself up. Pod 042, Pod 153, 6E called out, "Please be less useless." The pods obliged begrudgingly, 2B thought, although she might have just imagined their hesitation and laid down suppressing fire, forcing 2B to scramble to her feet and back off. Diving through a hail of bullets, 2B swung at 6E's unprotected midsection. Her sword clanged against a shimmering shield summoned by one of the pods, leaving 6E unharmed. 2B swung again and again with both swords, drawing sparks as energy shields appeared and dissipated one after another. 6E grunted in frustration as 2B bore down on her, glaring at the pods floating over her shoulders. "You may go on the offensive any day now, Pod 042. 2B's own support pod obliged her request, opening up and loosing a bolt of yellow-white lightning that latched onto 2B's chest like a claw and yanked her forward. As 2B's feet skidded across the snow, Pod 153 fired a laser and just barely missed, the beam ripping across the back of her ragged and blood-stained blouse, exposing the bare skin of 2B's back to the frigid air. The shirt had been a gift from Toriel, and between the bloodstains, the shredded left sleeve, and now this, it was more of a dirty rag now than an article of clothing. But 2B had no time to dwell on that. 6E drew back her fist and punched 2B right in the throat, her knuckles crushing 2B's throat as the energy wire released its grip on 2B's shirt. As 2B collapsed on top of 6E, 6E drove her armored kneecap into 2B's stomach. If 9's hadn't patched up 2B's wound earlier that day, the pain alone would have incapacitated her. 2B dropped the Otaki, which returned dutifully to 6E's hand, and raised her own sword just in time to parry a strike that would have cleaved her in two. 2B wrested the blade away, ducked under 6E's subsequent wild strike, and pinned 6E to the stone door, burying the virtuous contract up to its hilt in her gut. A spray of blood marred 2B's face, leaving red freckles across her pale cheeks. A pained smile slowly grew on 6E's face as she looked down, then back up at 2B, a faint flicker of awe in her eyes, a recognition that at last, the pupil had become the master. "Good work, 2E." She coughed, blood trickling from her mouth and coating her lips and turning them cherry red. Her face was pallid with agony, her breathing rapid and shallow, her pupils dilated. "I hope you are proud of yourself. That old woman. You'll be happy to know she feels no pain right now. I've saved her." A relieved half-smile tugged at the corner of 2B's mouth. She'd done it. 6E had failed, and now this nightmarish gauntlet of a day could come to an end. Once 6E expired, 2B would open that stone door and follow the corridor behind it, and there Toriel would be, safe and sound, and at long last 2B would be free to put everything behind her. She and 9's could finally embrace their new lives. It was over. 2B took a dazed step back, hardly believing it was true, the virtuous contract sliding halfway out of 6E's body. 6E reached down and clasped her hand around the hilt of 2B's sword as it protruded from her stomach, her fingers brushing against 2B's as the life drained from her body. Was it a glitch in 2B's visual processor, or were 6E's eyes glimmering with an unnatural pale violet glow as she stared past 2B? Blinking and refocusing her eyes, 6E drew herself closer and laid her hand on 2B's shoulder, pulling herself along the blade embedded in her abdomen. Her foggy breath was hot on 2B's cheek as she whispered into 2B's ear, "In fact, Toriel will never suffer again." 6E held out her blood-slicked hand, fingers twitching in her death throes and brushing against the edge of 2B's visor. A tongue of lavender lilac fire wreathed 6E's fingertips and traveled down her arm, conjured out of thin air as if she had become a sorceress, the pale violet light flickering and plunging her face into ghoulish chiaroscuro. My child. Chapter 19, See Heartache, Part 2. When the light of a flashlight swung across the bank of the river, Nines expected to run into 2B, not Undyne, but found himself relieved when the captain of the guard came to his aid. 2B had done the right thing. She'd gone after 6E first because stopping her was more important than rescuing him. "Hey, Nines, you all right?" Undyne called out as she drew closer. Nines nodded as he limped toward her. "Yeah. Thanks, Captain." He looked up at the sheer cliff wall. "Think we can still catch up to 6E?" Underneath her thick, furry coat, Undyne shivered. The climate was wearing her down. But it didn't strip the exhilarated grin from her scaly face. "If you're up for it." "Your legs." "Fine," Nines insisted. "I just have to walk it off." Undyne led him to the path that wound up the side of the plateau, Nines sparing a single glance over his shoulder at Chara's body before departing. The android gazed with sightless eyes, a faint memory of betrayal and anguish still burned into them like a brand. 2B pulled away from 6E as the horrible words sank into her ears, sliding her blade out of 6E's abdomen, dazed as she was engulfed by a creeping horror colder and darker than the frigid night air. Toriel will never suffer again. It was painfully obvious what she meant. When 2B had caught up with 6E and had seen her by the door, 6E hadn't been preparing to enter. She'd already come back. A part of 2B wanted to sink to her knees. A part of her wanted to cry, another wanted to scream, one wanted to throw herself to the ground and bury herself in the snow, one wanted to run past 6E and make a mad dash through the tunnel to Toriel's home because it couldn't be true, it couldn't be possible, 6E couldn't have gotten here so much sooner than 2B, she couldn't have. Emotions are prohibited. Emotions are prohibited. Emotions are prohibited. Emotions are. Despite the mortal wound she'd suffered, 6E stood up, sloughing off her torn-apart armor to reveal bloodied bare skin and the same kind of white singlet 2B always wore beneath her clothes. Helices of lavender fire wrapped around her body like snakes and licked at her wounds, binding to her exposed skin like sutures and covering up exposed patches of her chassis. With this kind of power at her disposal, 6E sneered, gesturing with a hand wreathed in flames, Toriel could have fought back. And she may have even been strong enough to hold me off until you arrived. But she knew better than to resist me. She made it quick. Painless. It was the right thing to do. 6E waved her fiery hand, leaving a trail of ghostly sparks meandering through the air in its wake. "I didn't gain much else from the old goat's soul," said 6E, "other than a lovely recipe for homemade butterscotch pie. If you come with me back to Yorha, I could bake one for you if you'd like. Would that make you feel better, my child?" 2B finally managed, in her shock, to squeak out a single word in a voice that was so much smaller, so much shakier than she'd intended, a single word in a voice that was nearly a whisper. A word she'd known, but had never in her life needed to use. She barely even heard it. 6E didn't either. "Ah," she sighed, "there's that look again. You know, when I told you about 14E, she told 2B, licking her lips, and I saw the look on your face when you realized you would never see her again, I was overjoyed. I could scarcely contain my glee. She was such a poor fit for you, 2E. You deserved so much better. Someone who could set you right. Why did you do it?" 2B shouted out, spurred into action by her own horror and pain to raise her sword against 6E. 6E easily overpowered her, as if the fire wrapped around her body was augmenting her muscles, and 2B fell back. She couldn't have hurt you. No. 6E snapped her fingers and let a tongue of lavender flame shoot from between her finger and thumb, tearing through 2B's cheek like a bullet. 2B cried out and stumbled backward, falling to the ground, her mouth filling up with blood as the stench of copper stung her nostrils. But she was hurting you. I could see it in that adorable little show of affection from this morning. Look at yourself. Look, 2E. 2B spat out blood and shook her head. That old nanny goat changed you, and not for the better. And it's not just her. You've grown so attached to so much, you've become chained to this wretched place like a prisoner. It's weakened you. It's dissolved away your resolve, your commitment. My God, 2E, 6E laughed, you're pathetic. 6E let the fire she'd conjured crawl up her arm, across her shoulders, and down to the tip of her sword, bathing its shining blade in phantasmal lavender light. Doesn't it feel awful? You see, with a big heart like yours, I have so many ways to hurt you, so many precious things I can take from you, but the most you can take from me is my life. Her laughter cut through the cold air. You see your disadvantage, don't you, 2E? You can't hurt me anywhere near as much as I can hurt you. The cold, overwhelming agony filling 2B's chest, this feeling that made her feel so small and so weak, vanished as 6E's derisive laughter pounded against her eardrums. Data streamed across her HUD, a series of readouts and targets appearing all across 6E's body and pointing out weak points. It was as if 2B could see through her. This wealth of information, it could only have come from a support pod with intimate knowledge of her enemy's condition. Was this pod 042's doing? Regardless of where the data came from, 2B took advantage of the targets, taking note of every fragile joint and unhealed injury her HUD pointed out to her as she charged with renewed determination. Half-hearted gunfire whizzed past her as the pods lamely tried to slow her approach. 2B was finished holding herself back. She cast aside her mentor's mantra and let her rage fully consume her. I can't hurt you as much as you can hurt me. We'll see about that. Each strike took 6E by surprise as 2B all but dismantled her. First, she aimed for 6E's left shoulder, a spray of blood following in the wake of the shining white blade. Next 2B slid past 6E, the slippery snow carrying her along, and struck 6E in the side, the virtuous contract tracing a scarlet fissure in 6E's pale flesh. 2B's foot collided with the back of 6E's knee, sending the murderous android to the ground before she drove her sword through 6E's other knee. 2B withdrew the blade, wiping it on one of the few remaining unstained patches of her clothing before raising it high above her head. Her HUD pinpointed the back of 6E's neck, the weakest part of her body. A strike there would kill her instantly, but 2B angled the blade away from it. She'd always been a consummate professional. She had always tried to eliminate her targets as quickly and painlessly as possible, but 6E was not nines. 2B wanted her to die slowly. She wanted to torture 6E for what she'd done. She didn't want to permit 6E to die until she'd paid for the life she'd stolen. You've finally learned. 6E shook her head. Lilac flames rippled over her body as she shot up, the fire dutifully knitting her broken skin back together, her hands bare, but covered in gauntlets of amethyst fire catching 2B's blade on the downswing. Your old master was a fool, and all her students turned out like her. Like you. Why? She swatted 2B's blade out of the air before conjuring her Otaki, the swing of her long, fire-wreathed blade forcing 2B to retreat. Because, 6E shouted out, it was always wrong to suppress our emotions. We androids were built to love slaughter, revel in carnage, and as an executioner, your duty is not to quell your emotions but embrace them with a wholeheartedness and zeal no other android can match. You should have cherished the moments you spent killing 9S. She flung out her arm and a burst of flame cut through the air. 2B tried to dodge the blast, only for the fireball to shatter against her hip, setting her clothes alight. As the flames licked at 2B's waist, 6E bore down on her, a flame-wreathed fist crashing into 2B's chin and knocking her off her feet. 2B felt, and more than that she smelled, the sizzling of her synthetic flesh as she sailed through the air and collided with a fir tree. She found herself nestled in a bed of needles for a brief instant before she slid to the ground, the tree's snow-laden branches depositing their contents on top of her. Mercifully, the snow put out the flames and spared her any further burns. Do you understand it now, 2E? 6E shouted. Are you finally willing to accept who you were made to be? 2B pulled herself up to her knees, needles brushing her shoulders, snow dripping down the bare skin of her back, the charred remnants of her clothes falling away from her low-cut singlet, the only part of her Yoarha uniform she continued to wear. We were made in the image of our human masters, she gasped. If they could find a purpose other than to fight, then. 6E swung her fire-coated sword through the air, leaving violet after images trailing in its wake, and with her free hand snatched 2B by the throat and lifted her off the ground. Her body, lit by the eldritch fire climbing like vines across her, long tongues of flame trailing behind her back like wispy wings, looked nearly divine, Yoarha's own fiery seraph. 2B felt 6E's fingers curl against her trachea like a vice, stifling her breath. A red haze began to seep through her vision, warning messages propagating across her HUD. It was beginning to hurt to focus on anything but the sound of her foe's voice. You wouldn't believe how good it feels, 2E, to have this kind of strength flowing through your body. 6E raised her face to the sky, closing her eyes in bliss, dropping 2B unceremoniously to the ground. Imagine, 2E, the two of us returning triumphantly to Yoarha with such magic coursing through our veins, clinging to us like second skins. How unbelievable that such a wealth of power was sitting here, unnoticed, all these millennia. 2B took so deep a breath she nearly choked on it. Follow me, return to my side, and we'll bring this power to the surface or stay, 6E shouted out, raising her sword over 2B, and let me erase your defective heart from this world. Proposal: Unit 6E should refrain from causing Unit 2B additional harm at once. Pod 042 and 153 hung behind 6E, opened up their hulls, and unloaded the full force of their destructive abilities onto their master, two beams of searing energy lancing out at 6E's unprotected back. 6E whirled around, conjuring a wave of pale violet fire to defend herself from the attack and consuming the pods. Both pods emerged from the flames, smoke, and ash trailing from their hulls, as they opened fire and targeted 6E with all the precision they had lacked earlier, forcing 6E to scamper through the forest, her burning aura setting branches and needles alight where she passed through. 2B found herself regaining her strength, galvanized as her and 9S's trusted companions fully regained their senses of loyalty. Damned pods! 6E snarled, tearing through Pod 153's hull with her fiery Otaki as a salvo of bullets from Pod 042 slipped through her fiery armor and loosed a spray of blood from her abdomen. Thoroughly bisected, the black pod fell to the ground. 2B rushed at 6E, aiming to impale her yet again. 6E sideswiped 2B and kicked her ankle out from under her. As 2B lost her balance and fell, 6E wrapped her arm around her and pinned 2B to her chest, rendering her a living shield to hold off Pod 042's attacks. 6E dug her fingers into the burn marring 2B's side, driving thoughts of combat from 2B's mind as her nerves cried out. With her other hand she probed the shallow but still profusely bleeding cut running across 2B's neck and collarbone. As 6E's fingers wormed their way into the wound, prying it further open and running bloodied fingertips over 2B's numb chassis, 2B stifled what would have been a wretched scream. 2B tried to shove the pain from her mind, but what replaced it was a maelstrom of emotional anguish of equal magnitude. She'd sacrificed 9s to catch 6E, and it had been for nothing. She'd still been too late, and now, here 6E was, using Toriel's soul, the culmination of her entire being, like it was a fucking battery. She felt something warm and wet press against the back of her neck, and it took 2B a second to realize she was feeling 6E's lips on her skin. Oh, dear, 2E, 6E whispered as she clutched at her, you've got a boo-boo, would you like mommy to kiss it and make it all better? Pod 042 hovered in front of the two androids. If the pod had had a face, 2B was certain it would be drawn in a tight scowl. Request: Unit 6E will release Unit 2B without further harming her. This support unit will not make this request a second time. You have 10 seconds to comply. Or what? The pod said nothing, unable to admit but knowing perfectly well that to hurt 6E, it would need to further injure her captive. As long as she was forced to play this role as a living shield, 2B couldn't count on her pod to save her. Ah! Isn't that cute? 6E dug her fingers deeper into 2B's wounds. Darling, you've even inspired your own pod to turn on its master. I'd be impressed. She tugged at 2B's burned and lacerated flesh, peeling the edges of her wound away from her chassis. If I wasn't so livid. Pod 042 may have been powerless to harm 2B even for the greater good, but 2B did not have such limitations. She held out her sword, flipping it to a reverse grip. Go to hell, 6E, she snarled, driving the blade into her own stomach and impaling both her and 6E. Next to the pain 6E was inflicting on her, the sword in her gut was nearly a mere pinprick to 2B. She'd positioned the blade to pass through a part of her torso containing little in the way of essential machinery, but hoped she'd gotten 6E where it would hurt the most. 2B grabbed the hilt with both hands and twisted, prompting a ghoulish howl from 6E as she staggered backward and pulled herself off the impromptu skewer. Freed, 2B ducked and rolled out of the way as Pod 042 unloaded on 6E, clutching at her wound as she yanked out the sword. Blood and other synthetic fluids pumping through her body leaked out and dripped onto the snow. With a savage roar, 6E swatted Pod 042 out of the air just as she had Pod 153, tearing through its silvery hull and aiming a blast of fire at its exposed innards. Damn traitor, she snarled, bearing down on 2B with her long, fire-coated Otaki in hand cutting blazing arcs through the air. 2B scrambled out of the way and with 2 clean strokes of her sword severed a long, thick length of a tree trunk as she put her distance between herself and 6E. As the treetop fell, 2B grabbed the liberated segment of the trunk, her fingertips digging deep into the wood until she had a firm grip, and leaped off of the stump, cutting herself a platform higher up as by decapitating another tall coniferous tree. Ignoring the error messages flashing across her HUD and the pain shooting up her side, 2B perched on the treetop, sword in one hand and length of lumber on the other, and swung the log like a battering ram. She released her grip and let it sail through the air toward 6E, a large, thick, heavy, improvised projectile with the speed and force of a cannonball. With a blossom of fire conjured in her free hand, 6E burned the wooden bullet to cinders, laughing at the ease of it all. 2B leaped off her perch behind the projectile log, using the flames as they dispersed as cover. For a split second as she came into view, her opponent's face registered shock. With a mighty swing of the virtuous contract, 2B lopped off 6E's left arm at the shoulder, hitting the ground on unsteady legs behind her and tumbling through the snow until she came to a stop lying on her back. 2B raised her head, hoping to see her hated foe bleeding out on the ground. Instead, she saw 6E standing above her with her sword held in her one remaining hand, her complexion livid, cords on her neck standing out as she scowled at 2B. 6E drove her Otaki into 2B's shoulder, just under the edge of her collarbone, and into the frozen ground, burying it up to its hilt. The pain was excruciating, finally wrenching a hoarse, agonized scream from 2B's throat. 6E crouched down and picked up 2B's sword, admiring the ivory-white blade of the virtuous contract as tongues of lilac-colored flames climbed up the sword, then stood up, admiring her handiwork as she panted with exertion, the lavender fire wreathing her body casting an eldritch amethyst glow across the snow and flickering shadows through the trees. "Do you believe it now, 2E?" 6E asked. "Do you understand now what makes you broken? Are you prepared to move past them? Or must I sever more of the chains anchoring your heart?" With her free hand, 2B reached out, trying to grab the sword's protruding hilt, but the agony racking her body made it nearly impossible, and her arm went limp at her side. "No? We'll see how you feel about coming with me once I've come back with your precious Nine's head in my hand." "No!" 2B shouted out, her strangled cry empty and impotent as 6E walked away, whistling. She lay there as 6E left her behind, the snow numbing the pain engulfing her as she looked up at the stone ceiling wreathed with dark clouds. Black sky. No stars. Once again, a good person was dead. Once again, it was 2B's fault. It followed her like a curse. Even here, in this sanctuary, wherever 2B walked, death followed. But never for her. Never, never for her. Wherever 2B walked, death followed, if not by her hand, then by someone else's. The tip of the blade nicked Toriel's throat, and at that exact moment the old monster's attacks instantly ceased. 2B's attack, however, did not. The blade kept going, piercing Toriel's neck just above her collar. Gouts of blood poured down her violet robes, staining them an even deeper black in the flickering and fading firelight. Toriel gasped and fell to her knees, eyes wide and unfocused, as 2B yanked out the blade. With a weak laugh, she spoke her last words. "Now I see who I was protecting by keeping you here. Not you, but them." She left nothing behind but a bleached pile of dust settling atop a stained and ragged violet robe. Had Toriel died like that to 6E's blade, too? Had she died in despair, knowing that 6E would go on to kill more innocents? Innocent. That was what Toriel was. On the surface, nobody was innocent. Everybody had blood on their hands. People like her did not exist. And now, thanks to 6E, one person like her no longer existed. 2B couldn't help but feel that in some small way, a rare, tiny part of the world, so minute but so important, had forever ceased to exist. I could undo this, 2B realized. I could erase this horror from history. Just as I did the last time. I could return to the beginning and set everything back the way it was. I could bring her back to life. But she knew that in returning to that 0 point, that moment she'd come back online after her flight unit had crashed, she wouldn't just erase this horrible day from her life. She would lose more than a week. Her time spent with Toriel, Papyrus, and Sans, Alphys, and even Undyne. Discovering Asriel in his strange new form and meeting his eccentric new friend. Helping Alphys prepare her gift for the captain she carried a torch for. Even the date to be been dragged on, the unexpected high point of this miserable day, that moment 2B had allowed a clearly love-struck Undyne to kiss her even though 2B did not reciprocate her feelings. The time Nines had sat next to 2B on their first night under this same stone sky and, holding back tears, he'd still believed in Yorha at that point, and the conflict between his duty as a soldier to return to the battlefield and his desire to explore this world at his leisure had been tearing him apart. Asked her if the two of them could stay, if only just for a little while, hoping her answer would validate a choice he'd been too afraid to make for himself. Nines. Nines. She would erase him again. Erase him like every other Nines. Like every other Nines, the boy he'd become over the past week would live on only in 2B's memories. The Nines who'd gaped at 2B in amazement after she'd thrown a snowball at his head. The Nines who'd thrown himself into danger to repair 2B when she'd fallen ill. The Nines who'd made friends with the monsters down in this underground realm so easily, a brief stint as a wanted man notwithstanding. The Nines who wore those adorable pajamas to bed and looked so cute with 2B's hairband tucked behind his ears. The Nines who'd called her his older sister. Every Nines had loved her, but no Nines had ever called her that. Try as she might, she would never be able to recreate him, just as she never could recreate any of the other Nineses she'd killed. The next Nines would be different, and in what ways 2B could not say. But even so, 2B wanted Toriel back. She wanted to hug Toriel again. She wanted Toriel to hug her again. She wanted to feel that kindly creature's furry paw around her hand again. She wanted to share more of those tentative, tender moments between an old woman who missed having a family and a girl who had never known what it was like to have one. Snowdon's general store had a small selection of clothing for the town's less winter-adapted citizens, small enough that it wasn't hard to try on every possible combination of outfit, which had been what Toriel insisted 2B do. My Type B uniform is sufficient, she'd informed Toriel. The old ex-queen had not taken that for an answer. Sufficient? Dear, you are practically nude in that thing. She clutched the ragged cloak that made up her disguise tighter around herself. Are you not cold? My model type is rated for full efficiency in temperatures ranging from -40 degrees to 100 degrees centigrade. Toriel merely sighed at 2B's technical specifications. True as that may be, I suppose, you cannot wear the same thing every day. 2B merely looked down at her dress. I don't see why not. It is made of self-cleaning nanofibers. If you wear black all the time, everybody will think you are in mourning. Why does that matter? The queen's next sigh was heavier, more exasperated, and with a slow, sad shake of her head she thrust a pile of clothing into 2B's arms. Please, 2B, try on one outfit. Whichever you'd like. The change will make you feel better, I assure you. With that, she'd directed 2B to a fitting room. With a quiet, resigned sigh 2B closed the door behind her, locking herself in a cubicle scarcely wide enough for her to spread her arms out, and stripped off her gloves, peeled off her boots, removed her skirt, and pulled her bodice over her head, reducing her to the standard white singlet beneath her uniform. She neatly folded her clothes when done and set them on the narrow bench next to the stack of clothing Toriel had picked out for her. She picked out the first 2 items in the stack. A simple button-down blouse, white cotton. Equally simple slacks. Khaki. They fit well. In the thin, floor-length mirror mounted on the wall, 2B saw someone who was certainly not a soldier staring back at her. She didn't look like Yorha anymore. In fact, she didn't look like any android she'd ever seen before. Her transformation left her awestruck. Toriel rapped on the door. 2B, have you chosen something yet? May I see it? She called out in a soft, quiet voice. 2B found herself taking a deep breath, as if revealing her chosen outfit was as nerve-wracking as leaping into a den of machines, before letting the door to the fitting room swing open. Oh, Toriel said. Oh. It's nice, Toriel admitted, wringing her paws. Evidently she'd hoped 2B would have chosen something else. Excuse me. She reached down and tucked in 2B's blouse. There. A bit plain. But there is nothing wrong with that. Simple. Businesslike. Very no-nonsense. I believe it suits you rather well, 2B. She smiled. It is a good start. Do you like it? 2B didn't know how to answer. Was she ready for this? A clean break from her past life? Was she as prepared as she'd thought to accept that her old life was truly over? Wait. I wish to see something. Remain here until I return. Toriel hurried off, returning a moment later with a flat, paneled wool hat and a scarf, both the same shade of pale gray blue. Brimming with excitement, she nestled the cap atop 2B's head and tied the scarf around her neck. Please, my child, tell me what you think. For once, 2B didn't know what she thought. She looked back at the mirror, then back at Toriel, waiting for an answer to come to her. One did not. She could not put the emotion running through her head into words. The smile vanished from the old ex-queen's face. I haven't pushed you into anything uncomfortable, have I? No, 2B shook her head. I like this. But why are you doing this for me? Well, I suppose, it has just been a very long time since anybody has needed my help dressing themselves, Toriel admitted. She placed her paws on 2B's shoulders and pulled her in for a hug. For what my opinion is worth, I think you look adorable. Muscles tugged involuntarily at the corners of 2B's mouth. Your opinion, Your Highness, she whispered, is worth very much. 2B pushed the memory aside, squeezing her eyes shut to dull the pain and staunch the flow of tears, hot and salty on her skin against the frozen pinpricks of snowflakes speckling her skin. Save for executing nines, the one activity she hated above all else was crying, and it was fitting that she usually did both simultaneously. There was no worse sensation than the gaping hollow it left in her chest and the pit in her stomach, as if more than just tears exited her body in the process. 6E had been right. 2B was soft now, weak, vulnerable because for once, Nines wasn't the only person in the world she cared about. The heartache she now felt, that was the price of love. Just as 6E had suggested, because 2B had allowed yet another person into her heart, she was broken. But, if androids like her were built to do nothing but kill, why were they made in the image of humans? Why allow them to weep at all? QQ query, it 2B. Is Unit 2-2B functional? She opened her eyes. Black sky. No stars. 2B turned her head, seeing through a veil of tears the blurry sight of her downed and mangled support pod, its sheared apart silver hull a black silhouette against the snow, dragging itself toward her with its single remaining manipulator arm. Care query, is UU Unit 2B? Affirmative, 2B answered. In the several years she'd been active, she'd been overjoyed to see a pod on only a few occasions. This was one of them. Unit 2B is functional. Analysis, Unit 2B is injured. 2B nodded. Yes. Unit 2B is injured. Annalise Sys, Unit 2B is hurt. Pod 042 reached her side, its cracked and sheared hull, frigid from the cold air, brushing against the skin of 2B's shoulder through her sleeve. Agonized and battered servo matters whined and whirred as the pod lifted its claw and wrapped it around the hilt of the Otaki plunged into 2B's shoulder. State, meant, P-Pod 042 will assist. The sound of her pod struggling with what little life it had left to free her was so horribly pathetic it made 2B want to turn her ears off. The blade pulled out a handful of centimeters and 2B gasped as fresh jolts of pain traveled from the wound across her body like the ripples of a stone skipped across a lake. The blip of an approaching black box signal appeared on 9SS HUD, and as he ran down the trail leading through the woods he informed Undyne. Think it might be 2B? Undyne asked, grinning through chattering teeth. If we're lucky. Nines drew the cruel oath. Nothing that had happened today had been lucky. If Nines had been afflicted by the same mental deficiencies that compelled humans to gamble, he'd have thought he was due for some luck. He knew, though, that such superstitions of probability were foolish to entertain. As the blip came closer and closer, Nines pulled ahead of Undyne and left her behind, the captain faltering under her own lack of stamina, compared to an android, of course, and the harsh climate taking its toll on her body. It was unfathomable that 2B would need his help at all. Not 2B. Not the strongest android he'd ever known. But 6E, just being around her did something to 2B. It cut through the stoic facade she kept up. He didn't know much about 2B's relationship with 6E, but he did know that 6E's mere presence was like poison to her, eating at her like acid etching through metal, and Nines wondered if it was because 6E was everything 2B was supposed to be. He had to get to 2B before it was too late. True to his intuition, the android who came down the path to meet him was none other than 6E, stripped of her armor, minus an arm, covered in blood, but triumphantly wielding 2B's own sword as a strange amethyst-colored aura surrounded her. She'd fought. She'd fought like hell. And it was obvious who the victor had been. With a wild, vengeful battle cry, Nines attacked, the fear that 2B had been killed pushing all sense of logic and reason from his head. At that moment he became less a scanner and more a berserker motivated by sheer rage and hatred. Virtuous contract met cruel oath, a blood-soaked ivory blade against a sword colored a polished brassy bronze copper, sparks flying between the two of them. Even with one arm, 6E was a formidable foe, and she laughed as she rebuffed 9SS assault. Getting in on that vengeance a little early, are we, Nines? She asked, giggling as she handily knocked Nines to the ground. Further incensed, Nines pushed onward, a flurry of strikes driving 6E back before she locked her blade against 9SS. Where's 2B? He shouted at her, the spit that flew at her face sizzling as it met her aura. What have you done to her? 6E's blood-soaked grin stretched from ear to ear. Why, I killed her. With her own late master's sword. Just as I'm going to kill you with her sword, the virtuous contract inched closer to 9SS face as 6E forced him onto his knees. Which will in the near future become my sword. You won't have a future. Nines retorted. With an anguished howl tearing through his very soul he parried 6E, forcing himself back on his feet and planting his foot on 6E's torso. 6E stumbled backward but did not fall, the pale violet aura surrounding her congealed into translucent wisps of lilac fire and shaped themselves into an ethereal arm to replace the one she'd lost against 2B. Nines stared on in shock, barely comprehending what he was seeing, as Undyne caught up to him with her spear at the ready. WH. What the hell are you? He gasped. I guess, 6E said with a grin as she flexed her fiery bicep and curled her ethereal fingers around the hilt of the virtuous contract, a twinkle in her eyes, you can say I've got royal blood. Undyne rushed past Nines with an enraged roar, arcs of lightning trailing like streamers off of her, and with a single swing 6E cut her down. Nines watched the captain fall, a trail of sparks and dust flying from a gaping wound in her side nearly bisecting her, the moment seeming to freeze time around it. He stumbled backward, his legs sluggish despite every subroutine in his body screaming with adrenaline, as 6E raised her sword and prepared to do to him what she'd done to Undyne so easily. Undyne had never known Queen Toriel Dreamer. Only what she'd read in the history books, the lessons she'd half slept through in school while daydreaming of glory and adventure. History did not speak kindly of Toriel, a woman who had cast her kingdom aside in shame while her husband announced a plan to bring hope back to the underground the way it spoke of King Ascari. Yet, as Undyne had trained under Ascari, as she had found herself under his kind and careful tutelage, she had seen how much Ascari still pined for her and how empty his home still felt even so many years later in those quiet moments between the two of them when Ascari felt permitted to show weakness over a cup of his favorite tea. Ascari still loved Toriel. Now she was gone. Even though Undyne never knew the exiled queen, she could anticipate Ascari's despair were he to learn what happened here tonight. She could feel the sorrow he would feel as acutely as if it were her own. That despair and the despair Undyne had felt the instant that fiery blade had chewed through her coat, armor, scales, flesh, and bone alike were both beyond anything she had ever felt. Of course, her training had prepared her to handle the knowledge that someone she'd sworn to protect was dead. Through rigorous exercises and role-play she'd taught herself to never give up, to not let the knowledge of failure overwhelm or paralyze her, to keep on fighting and make the bastards pay. But no amount of training could tell you how to handle a mortal wound. Those things, wounds like the one she'd just been given, they dusted monsters instantly, the killing intents behind them often so strong that a monster's morphogenetic field would break down without a moment's hesitation. Undyne could feel her body splitting apart, like any second now she would scatter into a million pieces carried on the cold wind. But something kept her going. 2B took a deep breath as Pod 042 silently lamented the horrible damage it had occurred and its inability to help free 2B from the sword pinning her to the ground. Pod 042, it's okay. A feeble orange light blinked within the pod's torn and mangled chassis. N-negative. Unit 9's is in, Dan, GER. Skins detect, black box signal, heading this way. D-direct CC collision, course, with 6E. 042 pulled the blade out another few centimeters. Statement, Unit 2B, SP Psycho, logical well-BB being is directly correlated to Unit 9's, SPH physical condition. 2B mustered a weary, appreciative smile. Pod 042 had always known her so well. Let me handle it. 2B lifted her hand, her numbing fingers sliding off Pod 042's claws as she tried to grasp the hilt herself. Pod 042 tried to pull the blade out another few centimeters, only for its claws to slip away from the hilt. Its arm hung frozen in place, its servo motors still protesting. 2B's fingers curled around the hilt and she picked up where her pod had left off. She could hear faint screeching as the sharp blade ground against her metal endoskeleton and subdermal chassis. Every throbbing ache made the world around her just a little darker, just a little colder. 9's. She kept going. A glowing spear cast a blue-green light across the snow and drove shadows from the surrounding spears as Captain Undyne of the Royal Guard stood between 9's and 6E despite nearly being torn asunder. Her spear, held in a death grip, crackled and pulsed, bolts of lightning rhythmically curling around it. Static, warm, and numb, washed through her body and those of the androids in time with the pulses. The look on 6E's face was almost worth the agony tearing Undyne apart. The crestfallen, gobsmacked you should be dead look, the what the hell are you look, the how can this be happening look. Deep, deep in my soul, Undyne huffed, the reverberations from her spear striking 6E's katana sending electric jolts through muscles that desperately wanted to unknit themselves. There's a burning feeling I can't describe, a burning feeling that won't let me die. That sensation, that strange feeling of fullness in her heart that pushed against the emptiness filling her body, chained every cell of her body to its peers. Determination. Slowly but surely 2B worked the sword out of her body, willing herself to feel a single-minded determination blocking out everything else. The pain was excruciating. In the minutes that passed her vision gradually became grainier and lower resolution, shadowy trees black against the black sky growing progressively blockier and blockier. Determination. This isn't just about monsters, is it? Undyne asked, forcing 6E to dig in her heels as strength renewed flowed through her veins, electricity carried on her blood as it spurted from her wound and splattered on the churned snow beneath her feet. I know what kind of person you are. If you get past me, you won't stop with us, will you? It didn't take long for the hilt of 6E's Otaki to rise so high into the air that 2B could no longer reach it, try as she might to stretch her arm far enough. The blade wasn't even halfway out, the rest of its length buried in the frozen soil beneath her. Fresh tears sprang to 2B's eyes behind her visor as her arm fell limply once again to her side. What was she going to do now? She wouldn't be able to catch up to 6E like this. She was going to lose everything else. Papyrus. Alphys. Ascari. Everyone, everybody in this kingdom, and even beyond, lightning crackled around and through Undyne's body just as fire wreathed 6E's android frame, aquamarine needles darting between severed muscles and bones and winding through the gap between flesh, cradling her heart and forcing it to keep pumping, forcing her lungs to keep expanding and contracting, forcing her gills to keep flapping. Everyone's hopes. Everyone's dreams. Vanquished without care or reason, just to sate a lust for death. Pod 042's battered and beaten arm whirred back to life and it reached over to 2B's face, brushed a lock of her hair away from her cheek, and tucked it behind her ear. Statement: IHH have the authority to see close Unit 2B's tier deducts, if Unit 2B would p if UWWWW would prefer. 2B remembered the sight of Nines falling dead to the ground. Again and again. A sword in his back, in his chest, across his throat, through his eye. She knew what it looked like to watch him die. There were so many times he died by her hand where he looked almost peaceful. As if he'd accepted his fate. He would not experience such bliss if 6E killed him. If Nines was still alive, 6E would surely make certain he died slowly and agonizingly. Not just to sate her psychopathic lust for violence, but to prove to 2B once and for all the folly of her feelings toward him. No, Pod 042. Steeling herself and squeezing her eyes shut, 2B curled her fingers around the blade itself, the sharp edge cutting into her skin. That will not be necessary. She did her best to pull the sword out even as her fingers slid up the blade and blood trickled down the polished steel. 2B wouldn't let 6E hurt Nines. No matter what. But I won't let you do that. Undyne shouted, gritting her teeth as she struggled to both keep herself whole and hold 6E back. Right now, everyone's hearts are beating as one. I can feel their hearts and hear their thoughts, their hopes, their dreams. I, Undyne, the spear of justice, the hope of the world. 2B sucked down and expelled lungfuls of air with every few centimeters the sword slid out, willing the pain away, until at last the sword, all 170 centimeters of its blade, came free and fell out of her blood-slicked grip. She screamed as the tip of the blade slipped out. For a few seconds, all she could do was lie there in the snow, panting and gasping for air as the wound tunneling through her shoulder pulsed and throbbed. At last, a breakthrough, the pain flooding her body replaced by a rush of endorphins forcing the last clouds of agony from her mind. Lightning rippled across her scaly muscles as Undyne broke 6E's stance and shoved her to the ground. Undyne stood tall, twirling her spear as lightning bounced between it and the electricity curling around her body, feeling stronger and more determined than she'd ever been before. I, Undyne, will strike you down. 6E took a combat stance, the amethyst aura surrounding her sparking and spitting as it blazed anew, her face a mask of indignant rage, as if Undyne's continued existence, her determination, was offensive. Undyne found herself smirking. You're gonna have to try harder than that. Query, you Unit 2B, do you, forgive me? 2B sat up. Grateful gulps of nourishing air slowly brought her fading systems into a stable, albeit undesirable equilibrium. Her right arm was numb and limp from the shoulder, where 6E had impaled her, her left arm worked, but the fingers on her left hand were barely mobile, the skin around the inner joints of her knuckles flayed and bloody. Mingled snow and sweat soaked her back, the cold air setting on it like flies on a dead animal. She looked down at Pod 042, reaching out with tortured and frozen fingers to caress the poor pod. It's okay. After all we've been through, I knew you would come around eventually, programming be damned. Thank you, Pod 042. For what you've done for me here. Analysis, Unit 2-2B. Why you are at me minimum C combat effectiveness. I am sorry. You did your best. You are a pod. That is all you can do. Statement, I have enough energy to run one final program. Pod 042 tried to wave its arm. It hung motionless in midair. 2B nodded. Understood. She did what she could to scoop the pod up, cradling it under her remaining functional arm, and rose to unsteady feet. We only get one shot. Point me in 6E's direction. Flames danced through the air, setting trees alight with reckless abandon as 6E dodged salvo after salvo of spears. The magical energies nourishing her body made her far faster, far stronger, and far more durable than any enemy Nines had ever found himself fighting save for the most advanced Goliath-class machines, and even with Undyne's incredible power at her disposal, icy fear gripped 9's black box. Nines staggered back, throwing off his coat as hungry flames engulfed it and letting the cold air seep through his shirt and prickle his skin. Blood oozed from a wound in his side where 6E's sword 2B's sword, it had to still be hers, 2B couldn't be dead had bitten him. 9S. Undyne called out, her voice hoarse from screaming, her spear twisting around 6E's sword as the two of them fought for an opening in each other's defenses. Hack her so I can pin her down. Got it. Nines called out in return. He hated having to relay his plans so obviously in front of the enemy, but that was the price you paid when your only ally was made of meat. Or meat and magic, or whatever monsters were made of. Undyne engaged 6E with renewed zeal to keep her from going after 9 seconds, crackling lightning and crackling fire meeting each other and throwing whirling eddies of sparks through the air. The two of them fought like titans, primordial elemental forces clashing with the zeal of an apocalypse in miniature. The chaotic patterns of lavender and aquamarine were almost beautiful, although Nines had no opportunity to dwell on them as he held out his hand and tried to get a bead on 6E through the maelstrom. The world around him vanished, replaced with the familiar monochrome world of hacking space, a world where he was a god. Bypassing 6E's firewalls was easy. The defenses guarding her motor systems were nothing for a master hacker like Nines. He darted through barriers and barricades, laying waste to digital defense emplacements with the goal to inflict as much permanent damage on 6E's systems as possible. But to 9S's surprise, lavender fire, the same fire-breathing 6E's body, crept into hacking space, surrounding him like invading kudzu vines, tightening around him. Try as he might, as adept as he was, nothing he did could clear away the literal firewall blocking his paths. It was as if the magic integrated with 6E's body was creeping into her systems like a three-dimensional object invading the two-dimensional world, an invader incapable of being fully comprehended within hacking space yet capable of affecting it. What the hell is 6E? Nines screamed as the feedback overloaded his systems, yanking himself out of hacking space as his visual processor glitched out with wild abandon and his limbs seized up. He fell to the snowy ground, writhing as his limbs contorted themselves, wheezing and gasping for breath. All of the visual data on his HUD health readouts, radar, sound data, etc. turned to gibberish. The energy of 10,000 monsters courses through my body. Undyne shouted out, her spear dancing around 6E as bolts of lightning shot up from the ground around her and froze into place, creating an ethereal forest within the forest. Their combined hopes, their dreams, their rage screams at me to defeat you. 6E took the grandiose speech in stride as she held her own against the captain's furious attacks, her face contorted in a grimacing rictus as emerald fairy lights crept up her legs and rooted her to the spot. With the android pinned and writhing uselessly, Undyne drew back her fist, a crackling spearhead wreathed in bluish sparks and arcs of lightning coalescing over her knuckles. Spear of the Undying, strike down my foe. Undyne's mighty spear strike tore through 6E's magically conjured arm, reducing it to a flurry of sparks, and macerated the flesh on the left side of her torso, prompting the android to wail in pain as electricity coursed through her body, leaving livid and jagged scars radiating across her skin like cracks in a pane of glass. 6E flew through the air, her own fiery aura failing to catch up with her body and hanging in the air like a ghost before dispersing, and collided with a tree, the impact of her fall tearing it to pieces. Undyne collapsed to her knees, spent, dust trailing off her body as she panted and gulped every breath of air as if it could be her last, the electric aura surrounding her growing fainter and fainter. Nines pulled himself to his feet, hardly believing what he'd bore witness to, and made his way to Undyne's side. Her scaly face had gone gaunt, giving Nines the strangest impression she was somehow being hollowed out from the inside. Who'd have thought, Nines said, that you monsters had a berserker mode, too? Undyne smiled weakly. What? Older Yoarha types had them in lieu of a self-destruct system. When engaged, the android would overclock all of her systems until they burned out. Pretty useful. Not sure why they got rid of it. Undyne's smile turned into a laugh. Yup. That's me, all right, she sighed, gazing into the smoldering trees. I think I'm spent. Dunno how much longer I've got. When you get back to town, tell Alphysai I really liked dating her, okay? Nines nodded. I will. Fighting at your side has been an honor, ma'am, he told her, holding his hand to his chest. The silence that had overcome the din of battle and blanketed the forest vanished as with an enraged and agonized scream 6E pulled herself to her feet, her aura still flickering faintly around her as it sought to hold her battered, burned, bloody body together. Her skin was split open in dozens of places, the edges of the holes all cauterized and blackened, revealing the pale and soot-smeared shell of her chassis beneath the thin layer of synthetic flesh and muscle. Nines forced himself to stand, drew his sword, and charged at 6E. He had to keep fighting. He couldn't let 6E get away. He couldn't let her live. If it was the last thing he ever did, he had to send her straight to hell. His hoarse battle cry caught 6E's attention, but only barely, and with a sadistic grin she tossed aside her sword knowing she didn't need it to defeat him and grappled with Nines. With only one arm she snapped 9's right arm like a twig, bending the joint in his elbow so far in the opposite direction Nines could hear the servos within whine and scream over his own screams of agony before the mechanisms broke down. She went to work on his legs next, her stomping feet cracking 9's chassis and breaking the mechanisms and bones within, hobbling him. 6E flung 9's battered and broken body away, and as he hit the ground he tried to scuttle away, pulling himself with his remaining good arm, nearly weeping from the pain. Crippled, humiliated, anguished. He and Undine had given it their all. 2B was dead and he couldn't do anything. Forget vengeance for 2B's sake. He couldn't even look after himself. 2B, he whimpered, trying in vain to escape 6E as she loomed over him. She was savoring every second he spent lying helpless before her, and he knew it in hauling his battered body through the snow. I'm sorry. Oh, you should be, darling. 6E conjured the virtuous contract back to her hand. You know, Nines, when I said I killed her with this sword, I was lying. Actually, I'm keeping her alive long enough to bring her back your head. Pod 042 guided 2B along as she stumbled through the forest. 2B picked up the pace as much as she could despite her body's protestations. 1,000 ways Nines could die running in a loop in her head. At last, in a clearing in the forest, she caught up. 6E stood in front of Nines, the flaming aura surrounding her weak and faint as if she'd reduced the reserves of magic lent by Toriel's soul to its dregs. Nines was crawling away as best he could, his right arm and both legs burned, bloody, and mangled. He was panting, his face ashen, his visor crumpled and hanging askew and letting one of his eyes peek out from under it. At last, this time 2B wasn't too late. 2B stood behind 6E as her foe took slow, deliberate steps toward Nines. 6E was too busy relishing in the terror writ all over 9's face to notice 2B. She took a deep, shuddering breath to fill her aching lungs, aiming Pod 042 as best she could. Pod 042, she whispered. On my mark. Laser. She swallowed the last of her trepidation. It was time to end this. Get away from him, you bitch. Pod 042 exploded in 2B's grasp, showering her with white-hot shrapnel that set her clothes aflame and chewed through her skin and the hard android chassis beneath with equal ease. 6E turned around to face the source of the outburst just in time for a burst of white-hot light to strike her between the eyes, vaporizing her head, burning away first her hair and skin and synthetic carbon fiber muscles, then eating away at her metal skull until nothing remained but the sharp smell of burnt ozone and atomized alloys. The fire climbing her body burst into a flurry of impotent sparks. 6E's decapitated body, smoke curling from the blackened stump of her neck, remained standing for a few seconds before crumpling to the ground. 2B lay sprawled on the ground, her synthetic fluids, blood, coolant, oils, various electrical fluids pooling around her through tattered clothes and shredded skin, all of the shards of Pod 042 embedded in her body forming pinpricks of agony as bright and multitudinous as the stars in the sky. A constant low beeping in her ears made her condition clear even without her HUD flashing rows and rows of error messages before her eyes, as it was doing now. Condition critical. It hurt even to breathe. N9s. Although her voice was quiet, Nines heard her calling his name and pulled himself over to her, his single visible eye widening as he gazed in horror at her wounds. Even though Nines was close enough to her that his nose nearly touching hers, 2B couldn't see the blue in his eye. Everything was gray now, her visual processors too weak now to discern color. 2B, he gasped, his voice shaking as he reached down and curled his fingers around the back of 2B's neck, helping her raise her head. God, you're a mess. Is she dead? Nines nodded as he did his best with his remaining functional arm to prop 2B up, supporting her with his own body. He didn't look much better than her. Shards of synthetic bone and cracked subdermal casing jutted out of the broken and shredded flesh of his legs and right arm, synthetic fluids pouring from lacerations in his skin. Mission complete. Unit 6E is dead. 2B felt lightheaded. It's pretty bad, she asked, isn't it? You'll be fine. Nines laid his head on her shoulder. 2B gasped and stifled a scream as the weight of his head pressed down on her wound, and with nearly paralyzed fingers hooked his collar and pulled him along until he was resting his cheek against her bosom instead. Sorry, said Nines, curling up next to 2B as the slow rise and fall of her chest soothed him. The warmth of his body, torn and mangled as it was, brought just as much comfort to 2B. She was just glad he was alive. For once, she didn't have to watch him die. For once, she. 2B swallowed hard as the text scrolling across her HUD became more frantic. For once, she would die before him. Nines, Nines put a finger to her lips. SHH. Don't strain yourself. Undyne limped over, her once cerulean scales pale and pallid as gray-white dust flaked off her body. Alphys is in town. She'll fix you two up. Don't worry. It's over. She fell to her knees in front of the two androids, pulling off her eye patch to reveal both her weary eyes before reaching out to help 2B and Nines remove their visors. I'm sorry we couldn't save the Queen, but, despite everything, I'm just glad you guys are all right. Nines chuckled at Undyne's choice of words. Okay, for a certain value of all right, Undyne admitted. The gladness 2B had felt seeing Nines alive began to fade. She knew she was dying. And when she did, when the last electrical signal in her silicon brain fell silent, the reset would roll on, an inexorable, involuntary process that would carry her back to that single turning point in her life to do it all again. Though time had only tied itself to her lifespan once she'd passed through the barrier and after effect of its magical energies, she supposed this was just another manifestation of a curse she knew intimately. She would live. She would live eternally. Everybody she loved would die. Everybody she cared for would die eternally. Only she alone would persist. That was how it always was. That was how it always would be. Nines, she hooked her fingers into his tangled and blood-matted silver hair. Why did it always have to happen like this? Why couldn't she for once just live with Nines? I don't want to go. You'll make it, 2B, Nines insisted. You don't understand. 2B shook her head, then she glanced up at Undyne. I have to tell you both something. I don't know why this happens. But, when I die, time turns itself backward. Back, to the time we first came to this place. Everything that has happened since then will be erased. You. Toriel. So she'll be alive again? Undyne asked. 2B nodded, her response brightening the captain's eye. Nines took the news better than 2B had expected. Well, that, kinda explains a lot. I sorta got this feeling you'd been here before and weren't telling me. I don't want to erase you again, but, 2B sniffled. But I wish this day had never happened, she whimpered. Undyne let out a bitter half-laugh and nodded. Me too. Well, most of it, she admitted. Most of it, 2B agreed. She thought she knew which part of the day Undyne was referring to. Captain. I'm surprised you feel the way you do. Hey. You may be a bit of a wallflower, Undyne said, forcing a snaggle-toothed smile as she brushed away the hair that fell in front of 2B's eyes, her fingertips leaving behind traces of dust that clung to 2B's skin, but you're gorgeous and a badass to boot. I'm proud to have been your friend, 2B. And you too, 9S. You won't be for long, 2B said, lamenting the cruelty of this cycle she always found herself trapped in. No. I'm not going to make it. This world, these memories, the time we spent together, will all be erased. Then, Undyne said faintly, I guess we'll see each other soon, 2B. Let's hope we'll be friends again. With that the captain smiled at 2B one last time before crumbling away, leaving nothing behind but a cold wind whistling through the trees. Silence blanketed the forest one more time, a silence broken only by the slow beeping that served as a constant reminder of 2B's encroaching mortality. "Come in, 2B, Nines insisted, reaching up to caress 2B's face, her touch light and warm on her bloodied and burned skin. "You've survived worse. With the bunker and the backup system, I have," 2B clarified. "I'm sorry. The you that exists at this moment, Nines, will never exist again. It's our curse." She craned her neck and looked up at the black, indistinct sky. "I'm so sorry." With the backup, Nines took a deep breath. 2B. "When you go back in time, only you remember what happened, right?" 2B nodded. "So everything goes back to the way it was when you started, except the data stored within your brain?" "Yes. I suppose. You can transmit data back to the past." 9S's voice began to brighten. 2B, "Anything you store in your memories, you can bring back with you." 2B understood what Nines was figuring out, but shook her head. "It won't work, Nines. An image file of your consciousness would take too long to transmit. More time than I have." "Oh, come on, 2B. I just have to store the past week. And even then, I can use thin provisioning and cut down on the file size by deduplicating my memories," Nines explained, his words nearly tripping on themselves on the way out. He was smiling the way he always did when he figured something out. "When we reset, just have me hack you and pull the relevant files out. Then I'll remember this, too." His fingers gripped her tighter. "I'm not gonna let you lose me again, 2B." 2B sighed, almost not wanting to believe there could be such an easy way out. "Do it." Nines closed his eyes, laid his hand on 2B's forehead, and began to collect his thoughts. 2B felt snatches of sights and sounds flit through her head too quickly for her to dwell on as Nines set up a partition in her mind and began depositing his memories, the core of his self. She had too much respect for 9 seconds to peek at his memories, but a few of them flashed past her mind's eye too vividly for her to ignore. She could see herself from his eyes in brief flashes, herself as Nines saw her, and read a snippet of text stating that her eyes were the same shade of slate gray blue as the surface of a lake during a rainstorm. 2B couldn't help but smile. That was what he thought of her? It was so stupidly poetic, she wanted to gag on it. After a long while, Nines collapsed in 2B's lap. It's done. Fingers crossed. 2B stroked his hair, her aching, half-frozen fingers catching on snarls and snags as they raked through his matted silver locks. She let her tears flow freely now. "Nines. It'll work. I promise. All the memories, all the experiences I'm about to erase, not just yours, but everybody's, just to save 2 people. Nines, tell me this is the right thing to do. Tell me it's okay to let go. Tell me and I'll believe you." "It's the right thing to do," Nines assured her. "Don't worry so much, 2B, I'm not sure we're just the sum of our memories anymore. Sometimes I feel like, deep down, subconsciously, I know things that have happened to other versions of me. I think everyone else is like that, too. Our souls, they hold more than mere data, even for us androids, and they follow us, no matter what body we occupy." "Thank you." 2B closed her eyes. She laid down and let the still, gravely silence filling the forest envelop her. Even the gentle buzz of her black box and 9SS, both humming in harmony, faded away, as did the softness and warmth of his bare neck beneath her hand. In spite of 9SS' enthusiasm that his plan would work, she could not help but feel she was on the cusp of losing him again. In her last moments, she longed only to hold him, her only family, closer, to be reassured by his presence before her body failed at last and this world was consigned to oblivion. The last sensation she felt was the sensation of a pair of tear-wetted, chapped lips brushing against her cheek. The last thing she heard was 9SS' voice, a softly whispered and faltering "I love you, 2B." 2B thought she said "I love you too" in response but could neither hear or feel if she really had. "Please," 2B pleaded in her head to whatever force in the cold, indifferent universe might listen, "if you would just let me have my Nines, if I could just salvage some of him this time." Chara found themselves alive again, and more than that, they found themselves somewhere they never would have expected to turn up after a reset. "Well," they said to themselves, fighting the urge to laugh, This is interesting. Ending C, lingering seers. Chapter 20, D. A World Erased. Asriel cherished the time he spent with Emil. The prince hated the body he was trapped in, this ugly round metal thing, hard and cold with jagged edges, and covered in rust and moss. But it wasn't so bad. Emil didn't like the body he had either, but shouldered his burden, as best he could without shoulders, with infectious cheer. When Asriel fell asleep in Emil's little shack tucked away in Temi village, the boyish-voiced stone orb cradled in his metal arms, he hardly cared that he didn't have his fur anymore. He and Emil were alike in so many other ways, too. Emil had problems with his memory too, so when Asriel pondered the massive blank spots in his life he could not recall, like how he'd ended up like this and what had happened to Chara, Emil was there to commiserate. The two of them shared what little they did remember over the course of the day they spent searching for the one other thing that Asriel and Emil found in common between the two of them. Both of them loved flowers. Asriel was partial to the golden flowers that grew in scattered places throughout the underground. They were more like weeds than flowers, to be honest, hardy and tough, they grew everywhere and dug in their roots. Chara had loved those flowers. They had spoken of them often, the flowers that grew in their hometown, and come to think of it, Asriel had no idea how those precious golden flowers had made their way down here. Chara had occasionally despaired of the lack of familiar flora in the kingdom and wished they could go back to the horrible, violent, evil world of the surface if only to bring down one of those sweet flowers. Someone else must have brought them down here in the long centuries Asriel had been dead. Emil's favorite flower couldn't have been more different from those golden flowers. It was called a lunar tear, and the way Emil spoke of it, it must have been beautiful and sweet-smelling beyond compare. Lunar tears were nothing like Asriel's favorite flowers, they were fragile, needy creatures, difficult to grow and harder to keep alive. Emil had rolled into the depths of the underground in search of just one of those flowers and had become trapped by the barrier, but in all the time he'd been down here, he'd never been able to find one while searching on, proverbial, foot. Like Asriel's precious golden flowers, lunar tears meant something important to Emil. Even if he couldn't quite recall what that was. After the two of them had met, Asriel spent an entire day carrying Emil around and exploring parts of Waterfall the Stonehead could not reach on his own. At last, just as they both began to feel fatigue setting in, they found a single lunar tear nestled among a cluster of buzzing echo flowers. The flower's silky white petals glowed with a soft white light, and Asriel and Emil basked in that glow for what felt like hours. A flicker of memory came back to Emil. He said the flower reminded him of a girl with silver hair he'd once known. Asriel wondered if that kind, yet icy woman who'd found him the other day was related to her somehow. And he remembered carefully cultivating a field of lunar tears and doing all he could to guard them against the encroaching and all-consuming desert. With that soothing vision of a whole field of shining lunar tears in his head, Asriel fell asleep that night with Emil at his side. He dreamed of electric sheep grazing in that field. But the next day, he woke up alone. All alone, and with the lunar tear he had worked so hard to help Emil find nowhere in sight. Asriel trudged through the slick, mossy tunnels of Waterfall, calling Emil's name with the harsh, robotic, ring-modulated voice he couldn't help but speak in. During her late afternoon workout, Captain Undine of King Ascari's royal guard stumbled and nearly fell off her treadmill, struck with a sense of déjà vu so powerful it was unlike any she could remember feeling before. Shrugging it off, she stepped off the treadmill, mopping sweat off her damp, shimmering blue scales and downing a bottle of water to quench her thirst. As she caught her breath, snatches of visions drifted through her mind like fragments of a half-remembered dream, and Undine found herself struggling to hold on to them for some reason she'd never had to try so hard to recall a dream like this before. It had been the strangest dream. There were two humans who'd fallen into the underground, yet instead of capturing them and bringing them to Ascari to save the kingdom, Undine had, of all things, befriended them. One was a boy with silver hair. He was a huge dork and a nice kid, but if you got on his bad side he turned into kind of a psycho. The other was an older girl, maybe his sister. And despite having a pretty stoic attitude she'd been gorgeous, like someone out of one of Alphys' animes. And their names were... What were their names again? Undine shook her head and draped her towel over the handlebars of the treadmill, then went back to her routine. Within a few minutes, the last vestiges of the dream and the sense of déjà vu that had nearly paralyzed her had faded away completely. She moved on to weight training and bench-pressed 2 other members of the guard. Dr. Alphys, 57th royal scientist of the Dreamer dynasty, had been feeding the memory heads when the same feeling that had overcome Captain Undine reached her. 2 humans. No, not humans, machines. Androids. Both with silver hair, one a boy, the other a girl. And their names were. Did they even have names? No, numbers. 9 and 2. One of the amalgamates let out a mewling burst of static and prodded Alphys' foot, begging for an extra morsel of food. The pins and needles sensation shocked Alphys out of her reverie, and she thought nothing more of her weird daydream as she stooped down to attend to the living monuments to her scientific follies. The numbers kept coming back to her throughout the day, popping out at her the way a word would on the first day she learned it, but those numbers, 9 and 2, meant nothing to her except that they added up to 11. Toriel was tidying up the puzzles littering the ruins of Old Home, recalibrating the myriad mechanisms in place which served as ancient fusions between diversions and door keys. She kept close to the entrance to the cavern where she'd laid her adopted child to rest so many years ago in case a new visitor fell into the mountain from the outside world. For some reason, she felt that today of all days, another human child would show up. Eyeing the yellow petals littering the cobblestones with distaste, Toriel figured that the beastly flower who tormented the poor inhabitants of the ruins may have had the same intuition as her. With a scowl, she finished outlining the correct sequence of switches for one puzzle on the wall, in case a child came through and needed help solving it. Before she could put away the piece of chalk she'd been using, though, she remembered something. Ah, yes. That was right. She'd found a gift for 2B9s. After she'd gotten the call from Sans that morning and been warned that trouble was afoot and she was in danger, Toriel had decided that those 2 androids would enjoy a token of her appreciation once the threat was dealt with. Toriel rummaged through her purse, looking for the nice little trinket she'd found for them in the ruins. It had been a. What had it been again? And who on earth had it been for? Toriel had lived alone here in the ruins for nearly 2 decades since the last human had fallen down and, regrettably, passed her by. Had she decided to get a present for the nice fellow she traded jokes with through the stone door to Snowdon? No. Whatever it was, it had been for 2 children. What were their names? 2B9s? Yes, that was it. Toriel scribbled the 2 names on the wall next to one of the switches just to make sure she wouldn't forget. 2B9s. Now, what could those numbers and letters possibly mean? Were they clues to a puzzle of some sort? Toriel couldn't recall why she'd written them down, especially here of all places, but supposed the answer might come to her later as she made her way through the old ghost town she and her ex-husband had once called home. A dingy computer monitor in a dark room displayed a series of linked parallel lines, some short, some long. A short, stocky monster in a disheveled blue coat observed the output, occasionally tapping on the screen with a bony finger. A little under 9 days between resets this time. Longer than the last dozen, at least. So at least there was that silver lining. To be honest, 9 days sounded like more of a blessing than it probably had been. Had his past self lived each of those days wondering if the next day would be the day his little world came to an abrupt end? It was a stupid question. Of course, he had. Sans wondered if maybe this time he could coccyx the culprit behind these temporal shenanigans out of hiding and put a stop to it, or if that would be a waste of time, just as it had probably been a waste of time for the hundreds of other Sans who'd ceased to exist after the last couple hundred resets. The only sign they had ever existed or that time had ever progressed beyond this day came from the readouts from the machine sitting in front of him. Eventually, seeing the entirely non-existent fruits of his labors, Sans had just given up on trying to wrangle time. However, time did still move forward, even if it occasionally looped back on itself. Sometimes whoever was controlling the flow of time would go back to the same origin point multiple times, but often the world would not reset to the same day or hour every time. Time sluggishly pushed itself forward in fits and starts like cars in gridlocked traffic, lurching along in frustrating spurts. Progress was made, but never very much. It had been going on like this for years ever since Alphys had become the new royal scientist. Of course, Sans had therefore suspected Alphys at first, and doubtless, dozens of erased alternate selves had followed up on that hunch, but the more he thought about that timid roboticist who didn't even know a boson from a gluon, the less likely it seemed. Smart as she was in other ways, she had no head at all for quantum mechanics. Sens trudged out of the lab. At the very least, no matter what changed, there was always still Papyrus, and there was always still Grillbees, and he could take comfort in that. Commencing system check. Memory unit, green. Initializing tactics log. Do you think she will be okay? Loading geographic data. Vitals, green. Remaining MP, 100%. Black box temperature, normal. That's odd. That other spirit, it's. Black box internal pressure, normal. Activating IFF. Activating FCS. Initializing pod connection. Statement, unable to establish a connection to the bunker. Proposal, find a position free of signal interference. Launching DBU setup. Activating inertia control system. Activating environmental sensors. 2B, are you alright? 2B. Equipment status, green. All systems green. Combat preparations complete _. 2B squeezed herself free of the wreckage of her mangled flight unit, setting foot on the grassy, flower-dotted soil coating the ground. She stood in a cavernous grotto, the only light coming from a small aperture in the ceiling dozens of meters above, filtering through the thick air and illuminating floating motes of dust. Yellow flowers with wide, bright petals fluttered at her feet, disturbed by her landing. On the other side of the cavern stood crumbling pillars, a weathered and eroded brick wall, and a yawning, arched doorway. Torches lined the doorway but offered scant illumination. Back in the ruins. Back in the past. Once again, 2B had erased the world. 2B patted herself down, ensuring that she was still in one piece. The civilian clothes she'd picked out with Toriel's help were gone, replaced with her standard black battler uniform. None of the grievous wounds she'd sustained in her battle with 6E had carried over. It was to be expected, of course, but still a shock to find herself sent back so abruptly over a week into the past. Nines rushed to her side, taking her lightly by the arm. He, too, was pristine and unharmed, clad in the black frock coat that made up his standard scanner uniform, his black visor obscuring his eyes but not the concern writ on his face. Everything in order, 2B. He was fine and the Nines 2B had known for the past 9 days no longer existed. Just like all the others. 2B restrained herself. At least until 9SS memories were restored, assuming his plan had worked, she had to pretend to be what she'd been a week ago. She couldn't afford to slip up and drop her emotionless facade lest Nines find her uncharacteristic behavior suspicious. Have faith, 2B told herself, glancing away from her partner as she swallowed a lump in her throat. Have faith in Nines and his plan. 9S, perhaps you should hack into my systems and make sure nothing is wrong. Nines nodded. All right. Take a seat while I run my diagnostics. 2B sat on the mossy ground, leaning against the cooling metal hull of her flight unit, and closed her eyes. A prickling sensation traveling up the back of her neck and crawling through her brain let her know that Nines had started his maintenance of her logic systems. She waited with bated breath. Was the partition still there? Had Nines really found a way to use her brain to transmit data from the future to the past? When Nines found it, if he found it, would he know what to make of it? Something wrong, 2B? Nines asked. And nothing. Your black box temperature just ticked up a degree. I wanted to make sure you were feeling okay. 2B nodded. Your concern is appreciated. Nines said, mumbling something as 2B felt a soft patch of static between her ears. It sounded like that's weird. What is it? There's a non-standard partition in your brain. Any idea who put it there? No clue. Let me take a look. Date created, metadata, 9 days from now, not impossible, but definitely odd. The sound of 9SS curious muttering was soothing to 2B as she waited with bated breath to hear his findings. Readme.txt. Pod 153 chimed in. Analysis, no traces of malicious software found. Oh, good. Well, Nines took a deep breath. Here goes. Initiating data transfer. 2B felt the pins and needles in the back of her mind run down her spine and suppressed a shiver as data flew invisibly between herself and Nines. Analysis, data transfer speed exceeding recommended norms. Proposal, halt data decompression immediately. Just a few more seconds. Don't worry, 153, Nines trailed off. 2B opened her eyes and looked up at him as he stood there, mouth slightly agape, slowly reaching up and holding a gloved hand to the side of his head as the shock written all over his face grew more pronounced. 2B pulled herself to her feet. 9S, are you feeling? 9S's legs gave out. 2B was at his side in an instant, grabbing him before he could hit the ground. Nines was limp in her arms as she lowered him to the mossy ground, and once again, he seemed so fragile. Pod 153 floated above him. Analysis, information processing exceeded the capabilities of Unit 9SS Central Processing Unit. Reboot in progress. 2B hooked her fingers in 9SS visor and lifted it up, watching his eyelids flutter as his systems came back online. Nines, she whispered. Nines smiled as his blue eyes opened. How about that? You finally called me Nines. Excuse me. 2B asked him, confused. Of course, she'd called him Nines. The two of them were long past that point. He should know that now. Unless. 9S, did it work? Nines looked around the cavern. Well, we both landed in one piece, so I'd say so. Anyway. What is the last thing you remember? 2B asked, cutting him off. Nines sat up, tapping on his forehead. Guess things are a bit jumbled up in here. You got shot down while we were strafing that machine airship. 2B felt her face fell. Nines let out a nervous laugh. Relax, Tubes. As you can see, I'm fine. Thanks for worrying. He reached out for her shoulder. 2B shot up to her feet and Nines was left grasping open air as if she were afraid to let him touch her. How could it have gone wrong? How could the Nines she'd been so hopeful about preserving just be gone, just like that? Something wrong? Nines asked with a bemused blink. 9S, stay here and take a minute to assess yourself for any injuries or irregularities. 2B spun on her heel and walked off into the familiar ruins. The distance between her and Nines grew. I will scan ahead and assess the area. Nines watched her depart, completely oblivious of the inner turmoil tearing through 2B's head. Oh okay. 2B stormed through the ruins, pushing through whatever puzzles impeded her progress, and kept her composure until she was certain Nines was out of range. Deep within the crumbling village where cobblestone roads intersected around an overgrown and vine-choked fountain that had gone dry long ago, 2B came to a stop. At the first point at which 9SS signal had dropped off her radar, she fell to her knees. And sobbed. Statement, Unit 2B, it appears an ailment is affecting your logical operations. Shut up. 2B doubled over, the torment of what she'd done, what she'd failed to do, tearing at her inner machinery like a hungry rodent that had made its way into her innards, her fingers tearing at her visor. She pulled it off her head, crumpling it in her face and throwing it to the ground. Proposal, return to Unit 9s for additional maintenance. Pod 042, I order you to shut up. Query, Unit 2B, are you alright? Pod 042, I order you to halt all logical thought and speech. At last 2B was left alone in the village square with nothing but the sobs wrenching themselves from her hollow chest to keep her company. Things were supposed to be different this time. Things were supposed to be different this time. Things were supposed to be different this time. Her fist pounded the cobblestones beneath her knees, cracking the stones. She'd killed him again. Nines was gone again. 47 times she'd killed him now. 47 times. Why couldn't she stop? What was wrong with her? 2B kept driving her fist into the street over and over again, once for every version of her partner, her companion, her friend, her family she'd obliterated, until her glove was as shredded as her skin, until synthetic blood dripped from her knuckles onto the crumbling stone, until the pain signals began to compete with the pressure squeezing her chest. Statement, boy, you sure are a mess, 2B. 2B wiped at her eyes. Dancing in front of her was a grinning flower. What's the matter? Floey asked. Someone like you ought to be used to erasing people, I'd think. Remember our first little trip through this miserable little place? How easily it all came to you. What happened to the 2B who killed without hesitating? With an enraged growl, 2B swiped at Flowey, only for the flower to wriggle just out of her reach. Ah, don't let it get to you. Sure, maybe poor Nines grew more in the past 8 days than he had in his entire life, and sure, maybe he won't ever develop into the same person you had the misfortune of killing, and sure, maybe you've erased something truly beautiful and unique from the world. 2B lunged at Flowey with her sword drawn, but he was too fast even for her and popped up a safe distance away on the lip of the dry fountain. So, why'd you do it? Got bored with him, maybe, and figured it might be nice to shake his Etch-a-Sketch clean and give the wheel another spin. Flowey wiggled underground and did not pop up again, but continued to speak to her. Or maybe you reset because you didn't catch up with 6E in time to save Toriel. You chose that doddering old cow over your only friend, didn't you? Boy, I bet that's eating away at you. With roving eyes 2B scanned the area, fist clenched around her sword. Or, is it? Admit it, 2B. You don't love Nines as much as you think you do you? 2B paused, her breath caught in her throat. And, you don't love him anywhere near as much as he loves you. Her sword flew through the air and impaled itself in the vine-choked statue standing in the center of the fountain. Shut up. There are things I know about Nines that you'll never know. Because you erased him. But you're the apple of his eye, the center of his world, the dearest and darlingest, and only, member of his family. You're the most important person in his life. That boy would go to war for you if he only had the chance. And that's the one you threw away. 2B fell to her knees once more as she buried her face in her hands. Stop it. You could never understand, you soulless abomination, she choked out. How could you understand love? You aren't even the real real. There was no answer. And as the silence lingered and stretched 2B realized that, having exacted enough torment upon her, Flowey must have taken his leave and found a quiet place to savor the pain he'd inflicted. 2B curled up in the middle of the road and tried to face the cruel hand time had dealt her. This pain wasn't worth it. She should have clung to life. She should have fought harder. She shouldn't have let herself care about anybody but Nines. You poor young thing. That miserable creature was torturing you, wasn't it? A soft, heavy paw fell on 2B's shoulder. 2B glanced upward and gasped in spite of herself. Oh, dear, you look like you've seen a ghost. Do not be alarmed, I mean you no harm. I am Toriel, caretaker of this place. The old monster towered over 2B, smiling sweetly as she always did around her. What is your name? 2B stiffened and shrank away from Toriel's touch as if it were poison. She couldn't deal with this. Not now. Not like this. Not after she'd already lost Nines. Why couldn't Toriel have been anywhere but here? It is okay, Toriel insisted. You are safe here. She wrapped her arms around 2B the same way she always had, and that was too much for 2B to handle. Immediately, 2B pulled herself away and stood up straight. Pardon me, ma'am. I do not require your assistance. The words tasted like oil in her mouth. It was always this way when she met a new Nines. Putting up those walls around herself always felt vile, but it was easier than keeping all those emotional nerves exposed and raw. Are you sure? Toriel asked, eyeing 2B with a skeptic glance. 2B bent down, picked up her visor and put it back on, then called out to her pod, 042, resume all logical processes. Pod 042 hovered to her side. Statement, logical processes resumed. Toriel, 2B paused. What did she have to say? Would it be better to say nothing to her at all? It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. My name is 2B. There was an instantaneous flash of recognition on Toriel's face as if for a fraction of a second she had remembered the future 2B had erased. Oh. What a nice name. She clasped her paws together. Well, 2B, regardless, I would appreciate your company if it is not too much trouble. Already making friends here, huh, 2B? 2B glanced over her shoulder at the unmistakable sound of 9SS voice. There he was, his pod at his side, with a sideways smirk on his face as he strode down the abandoned road. 9s, she breathed, guilty over leaving him behind to wallow in her misery. I'm so. Hey, don't worry about it. Nines reached out, laying a hand against 2B's arm as his smile grew. Before 2B could react, Nines hugged her, wrapping his arms tightly around her and resting his cheek on her shoulder. I'm sorry, 2B, he whispered, trembling just a little as he held her close. I didn't expect the memories to take so long to sink in. His voice cracked. You were really scared, weren't you? With a slow, unsteady motion 2B returned the hug, gingerly, half disbelievingly as she pressed her counterpart closer. Had she and Nines finally cheated the curse that followed her no matter how far she fled it? Do you really remember everything? She asked. Nines laughed as he hung his head on 2B's shoulder. Yeah. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I can't believe it actually worked. You shouldn't have, you idiot. 2B reached up and playfully patted him on the back of his head, tooling his already mussed silver-white hair. He felt so much more solid to her now than he had before, and 2B hugged him as if she would never let him go again, grateful the visor did such a good job of covering her tears not of grief, for once, but of relief. But it's nice to have you back, Nines. Starting over had always been hard for 2B and it still was. But at least this time she didn't have to start from scratch. This time, she'd managed to save someone. She and Nines took up Toriel's offer and followed her to her humble house, and life began anew. 6O loved to stare at the Earth. Through the wide windows in the central corridor of the bunker's main deck, the Earth would lazily swing by, filling up the portholes like a great leviathan swimming past a submarine, a beautiful cloud-streaked orb of blue and brown and green, but mostly blue. It was strange how from this distance the strife consuming her home planet's surface was completely invisible, yet 6O knew that down there were hundreds of elite Yoarha units striking from orbital bases just like this one to assist the tens of thousands of scattered androids in their struggle to repel the machine lifeforms running amok across the planet. 6O could get lost in that sight of the Earth, just as she often got lost in the sight of the magnificent flora and fauna that still lived and thrived down there despite the long wars while monitoring 2B. She would sometimes work up the courage to ask 2B to look for a specific flower or animal she'd read about and take a picture of it for her records. She always felt such a fluttering in her chest when 2B acquiesced to her requests. 2B. She'd been missing in action for a few days now after the assault on the Goliath-class flying machine. When the 5th Air Squadron had finally brought the behemoth a veritable floating battleship and factory in one down, there had been a weary cheer from everybody in ops, but 6O had only found herself staring at the static on her monitor, silent and forlorn. She and 21O had shared a knowing, sad glance. Of course, 2B would come back, but why was it taking so long to restore her and Nines from their backups? 6O felt so listless without her. Beautiful, isn't it? 6O was startled out of her musings by the android who'd walked up beside her. The intruder was nearly her doppelganger, the same face, but hair a pale lilac instead of blonde and eyes purple instead of blue. 6E laid a comforting hand on 6O's shoulder. Sad about 2B, huh? 6O found 6E unsettling for multiple reasons. Not only did she have no concept of personal space whatsoever, not only did she have a reputation for making her sparring sessions with other androids as bloody as possible, not only did she speak to everyone like they were the best of friends, she was built with the same personality template as 6O, and that one fact revolted 6O beyond measure. Deep down, did 6O, a humble operator, really have the potential to be that? Wishing she were anywhere else right now, 6O nodded. Well, just hang tight, darling. I'm gonna talk with the commander about leading a search and rescue team. 6E smiled. Why don't you tag along? T to the surface. Type OS were designed to support field agents from the safety of the bunker. They had no combat subroutines and relatively frail bodies. 6O would give anything to be able to walk on the surface of the Earth herself, but she didn't relish getting inevitably killed by machines. Due to the relative safety of their lifestyles, Type OS backed themselves up far less frequently than other Yoarha units, and usually didn't bother with full memory backups at all. 6E patted her on the head. Oh, darling. Of course not. I'd like you to come with me to see the commander. 6O trailed behind 6E to ops, the center of your HA's complex nervous system, and took the elevator down to the floor, flanked by rows of operators just like 6-0 dutifully monitoring their assigned units on the ground. It seemed busier than usual today, which made 6-0 glad she wasn't on schedule while 2B was gone. Then again, perhaps her co-workers would be less busy if she were there to take up someone else's shift. Commander White ran the bunker from the floor of ops where she could easily bark orders at all the operators on staff and expect them to be relayed immediately to every unit in the field, and did so with an efficiency that was at times brutal. She struck a pale figure in a sea of black uniforms, a white kipao clinging to her body, a long ponytail of ash blonde hair spilling down her back. Her eyes, cold and green, could paralyze with a glance, or, at least, that's what it felt like at times. "We have been deliberating your request, 6E, said the commander. Black armored Type B and Type E units accompanied her with swords at their sides as she held her hands clasped behind her back. I have decided that Unit 2B and Unit 9s shall be restored from their backups. 6E's face fell, while on the inside 6-0 was elated. Commander, 6E insisted, I know 2B is out there. We can't just leave her out there to fend for herself. We have received no black box signals, nor pod signals, from either unit since Operation Argama concluded. We should assume 2B and 9s are no longer active, especially this many days after their disappearance. With all due respect, Commander, 2B isn't stupid enough to. The commander drew her riding crop from her side, leveling it at 6E's neck. Choose your words carefully, 6E. You are not among equals. 6E glanced at 6-0. Back me up here, dear, she whispered. I think it's a good idea, 6-0 offered, timidly raising her hand. I mean restoring them from their backups. You're right, Commander. 6E glared daggers at her before softening her gaze as she turned back to face the commander. Commander, I have too much respect for 2B to believe she died in that operation. And that mountain is a huge blank spot. There's something fishy about it. We shouldn't restore her from her backup until we know she's. First off, misfortune befalls even the best of us. The commander's gaze softened. However. Excuse me, if I may interject. A Type B unit wedged herself between 6E and 6-0, addressing the commander. As a Type B, she wore the same kind of elegant black dress and asymmetric visor as 2B, but that was where any similarities between the two androids ended. This one was skinnier, more of a beanpole as far as physique went, and had shoulder-length reddish-brown hair pulled away from her face with a hair clip. The commander turned to face the intruder. And you are? Unit 13 Type B, ma'am. My apologies, I couldn't help but overhear. You would agree that our resources are spread too thin to mount a search and rescue mission, especially in light of our recent engagements with the machines, wouldn't you? 6E was livid at 13B, but deep down, 6-0 was delighted. The commander nodded. Turning to 6E, she said, Unit 6E, you could learn a thing or two about sensibility from 13B. 6E, 6-0, 13B, you are dismissed. 6E stormed unhappily out of ops. With a smile on her face, 6-0 headed back to her quarters. She couldn't wait to get back to work. More than that, she couldn't wait to see 2B again. Just imagining the sight of her made 6-0's spirits lift, especially when her thoughts drifted to that beautiful face and certain other features of 2B's anatomy. The one thing 6-0 wanted to see more than the surface of the earth was 2B in her quarters wearing nothing but her singlet, or perhaps even nothing at all. Excuse me. 6-0 stopped in her tracks, jolted out of her amorous reverie as she made her way down the corridor. She turned around and saw 13B briskly jogging over to her. Oh, thank you, 6-0 said, trying hard to pretend she didn't feel as though her uniform had shrunk 2 sizes as 13B caught up to her, for what you said to the commander back there. It was nothing. 13B smiled. I simply despise wastefulness. Thank you, nonetheless 2B means a lot to me. Embarrassed, 6-0 clasped a hand over her mouth. I mean. No need to feel embarrassed. She means a lot to me, too. Relieved, 6-0 sighed, and returned the other android's smile. Really? How do you two know each other? 13B simply laughed. She said, one could say I've been in her head. Check the description for the links to the author.